Chapter 51, Thales and Zayn, 1. When Thales was invited out of Mindy's hall by Gilbert and Jins, both had solemn expressions on their faces. He had no idea what was occurring. What happened? For the first time in over 20 days, Thales stepped out of Mindy's hall cedar wood door. Looking at the familiar dark-colored carriage, his face was filled with bewilderment. Gilbert will explain it to you. Jin's unsmiling face made him nervous. She swung the whip in her hand and gracefully leaped onto the driver's seat. Her answer was short and simple. What you need to do now is to get on the carriage immediately. With his mind in a muddled state, Thales turned his head back. The middle-aged noble produced a boarding stool out of nowhere and softly put it on the ground. Please get in, young sir. Madame Jins does not like sitting in the carriage. My apologies, you will have to bear sitting with an old man like me. Gilbert's effort in attempting to be humorous was a complete failure. Even the two horses could tell that he was gloomy with worry and deliberately avoided them. What is happening? Filled with anxiety and fear, Thales stepped onto the boarding stool and then the carriage pedal. He turned his head back and glanced at Mindy's hall's guards, only to see that they showed no signs of leaving with him. As if they had sensed Thales' gaze, the swordsmen lowered their heads respectfully, with Cora in the lead. They won't come with us, one carriage will give us more of a low profile, Gilbert stated flatly. Thales looked at the two people's incredibly grave faces and quelled the desire to get to the bottom of it. He only asked one question, will we come back after we go to the palace? Gilbert's voice was slightly grim. It depends on His Majesty's will. Please pardon my rudeness, but we must hurry. Matters are that serious? Thales no longer said anything else. He sat in the carriage, and Gilbert, who entered right after him, closed the door lightly. The dark coach was still the same as around 20 days ago. The interior was still filled with those dark red couches, the glass adorned with crystal drops, the crest of the nine-pointed star decorating the walls of the carriage, and that faintly glimmering fluorescent paint. Jin's whip struck the horses lightly and rhythmically, but the speed of the carriage was much faster compared to the previous time Gilbert drove it. Of course, it was also a much bumpier ride. As the carriage jerked around, Gilbert looked at Mindy's hall, under the moonlight, and slowly disappearing from the window, then he looked at Thales solemnly. We are in a hurry, so I will choose what is important to tell you. Aside from the time when they spoke in the secret chamber, Thales had never seen Gilbert so serious before. This made him apprehensive. Extet diplomat group is scheduled to visit Constellation after New Year. The middle-aged noble looked at Thales seriously. Thales narrowed his eyes and tried his hardest to remember the history of the continents from 20-something days ago. Extet, the country that was built in the north by the humans' hero during the Battle of Eradication, Rikaru Extet. Great Dragon of the North, the hero's country, Western Peninsula's blade, Constellation's powerful neighbor to the north. Gilbert continued speaking seriously, the Northern Territory has sent urgent news, 3 days ago, Extet diplomat group, has been completely wiped off when they were on the road in Central Hill, located to the south. There were no survivors. Thales widened his eyes in disbelief. Gilbert sighed. The victims include 6 Extet nobles, and Prince Moriah Walton. He is the only son of Nuvan VII, who is the king of Extet and also the Archduke of Dragoncloud City. Prince Moriah is the Walton family heir and the next Archduke of Dragoncloud City. The transmigrators sucked in a cold breath. The king's only son in the strongest country in the Western Peninsula and the heir of their neighboring land, was killed within Constellation's territory? No one survived, including the nobles of Constellation who accompanied them. There are no clues. The only thing they found were a string of words formed when the victim's blood was poured on the ground. Gilbert looked into Thales' eyes and, with worry on his face, he nodded lightly and said, the Empire shall last, so long as the stars remain. Jade Star family's motto? Thales was momentarily stunned. This method is clearly just a bad, childish way of transferring blame and causing strife between two countries. Thales thought about the nature of this matter, and he suddenly realized something. With disbelief, he lifted his head and asked, is it truly effective? Unfortunately, it is effective and very bad, Gilbert answered in a low tone. Very bad? Thales' heart was filled with apprehension. The carriage charged into Twilight District, entered King Street, and headed towards the central region. King Street was one of the largest streets in Eternal Star City. The population there was only second to Central Region, which used its northern territory as a transport hub. King Street had the Star Plaza where merchants from various countries set up shop, and a grand bazaar located to the side of Western City Gate, where the low-class citizens gather. Compared to XC District and Western District, which still had their streets lit by torches and animal fat, the King Street was lit with everlasting lamps that were just slightly inferior to the ones used in Eastern City District. More pedestrians gradually appeared. These people ranged from bards performing on the streets, to merchants shouting from their shops. Some of the shops that still operated at night, such as boutiques and watch shops, were still open, to servants who were rushing about on errands from their masters, to officials who were engaged in social activities, to even true nobles, riding in carriages or even walking down the streets. Their carriage was not in the slightest bit eye-catching. The King Street was located right at the intersection between Twilight District and Central Region. The ratio of the wealthy and the distinguished there was incredibly high. Compared to the Star Plaza and the Grand Bazaar that Thales had seen before, this place was clearly more reserved and quiet. It lacked the loud noises and bustle of activity, along with the crude and vulgar atmosphere the latter possessed as a local market. However, even in this place, beggars in rags and homeless people were occasionally seen on both sides of the road stretching out their hands to passers-by while moaning. Fortunately, the carriage had a one-way mirror, and those outside cannot notice the actions within the carriage. However, Thales' mind was on Gilbert's words at that moment. He only cast a quick glance at the sights in the streets. The Foreign Affairs Minister's words continued traveling into his ears. The key lies in the Fortress Treaty. At the end of the bloody year, Extet invaded our land. Broken Dragon Fortress fell into enemy hands. Then, from the Northern Territory, Land of Cliffs, Western Desert, to the Eastern Sea, most of Constellation was invaded by the flames of war. We had few soldiers, and our generals were weak. The kingdom was almost losing all hope. His Majesty, who had just succeeded the throne, even thought about enlisting children below 14 into the army. Gilbert exhaled a long breath. There was a dazed look in his eyes, as if he was thinking about the events in the past. Based on the fear of all the other countries in the Western Peninsula and the attention by the Eastern Peninsula's main Eteinox and Hanbul towards the affairs within the Western Peninsula, the Foreign Affairs Department mediated between countries with everything that we had to have other countries interfere in this matter. In the end, we forced Extet's soldiers to retreat the way they came. They signed the contract, and Extet was even forced to relinquish a barren piece of land they occupied before the bloody year, which belonged to Constellation in the past. I was the signatory for the Fortress Treaty. I would know this like the back of my hand. Thales' eyes brightened up. We lost the war, but won the negotiations? Gilbert nodded, but there was not a hint of relaxation on his face. This is the horrible part. Instead of saying that this is an agreement, it would be more accurate to say that it is a record of humiliation. The carriage moved forward a little more. A number of beggars appeared on the road. Some of them even stretched out their hands towards Jins, who was driving the carriage, but the female official wore a cold expression on her face and ignored all of them. She struck the horses with her whip even faster. At the moment when you have won many battles and when you are just a hand's reach from land and riches, you are forced to withdraw your soldiers and even give up your land due to the cooperation of various countries. This sort of failure is even more humiliating compared to losing a war. Many of the suzerains, especially the archdukes in the south and who shared borders with Constellation, were furious, to the point where the contract had even shaken King Nuvan's rule. During these 10 years, the Great Dragon's relationship with Constellation had always been Chile. And now, with Northern Territory discovering a large crystal drop mine in Eastern Sea having deep sea whales that contain a lot of oil. Gilbert sighed. Thales whispered in his heart, Extet, a country that is still being formed with a nation that is still building their own culture, a country that became unified through the hardships of battle. Extet suzerains, or at least the 3 archdukes that share their borders with us, have always been eager for battle. They long for the large mass of land, resources, and riches that had been within hands reached 12 years ago but in the end, were a missed opportunity. Gilbert shook his head and looked out the window. Grief appeared in his eyes. That's why the Extet diplomat group visited our country. They're determined to restructure the Fortress Treaty and rebuild the borders of the 2 countries. Yet now, before the diplomat group reached Eternal Star City, they were killed midway. Can you imagine the situation that will occur in Extet when the news returns to them? The carriage ran over a bumpy road, and the entire coach jerked. Thales frowned. You think that Extet suzerains plotted this disaster? Just so that they can incite war and snatch our land and our resources? Gilbert lifted his head. At that moment, his gaze was incredibly terrifying, and the former Foreign Affairs Minister stated coldly, it's worse than that. Extet's king selection system is where the great suzerains will vote and choose a king. Over the past several decades, the Walton family has sat on the throne for 2 full generations, and Nuvan VII is definitely not some beauty that everyone loves. Thales spoke with sudden realization, so this is some of Extet suzerains' uniform desire to search for resources beyond their country and change their king? Gilbert took special care to guide the kingdom's only Jadestar family kin and said lightly, you're close, my young sir. You just need to take one step further in your thoughts. Just one step further. During this period of time where the matter of the diplomat group being assassinated will cause an impact, the pressure of this matter will fall entirely on King Kessel's shoulders. No matter what decision we make, what sort of answer we give, whether we should fight or form an armistice, what method we would use to approach this matter, whether we should be aggressive or gentle, whether we should preserve our glory and be humiliated, everything will be on His Majesty's shoulders, right from the start. All the nobles in Constellation will fix their gazes on Renaissance Palace. Are you saying that? Thales asked in a puzzled tone. No matter how much intelligence he possessed, he was not well versed in the nobles' rules. He did not understand the significance of this matter. During that instant, Gilbert's eyes suddenly turned complicated and profound, causing Thales to be unable to decipher them. First of all, conducting this matter might be complicated, but it does not matter whether we fight or choose to form an armistice. His Majesty will not be able to escape from being criticized as a cold-hearted and ruthless king who disregards his people, oppresses the weak, and embarrasses Constellation. This will greatly impact His Majesty and Jadestar family's reputation and influence in the kingdom. Thales' pupils contracted. He can finally begin to understand the meaning behind why the situation was worse. Next, if he wants to handle this great matter, then His Majesty will need power that surpasses what is possessed in the territories directly under the royal family's name, be it in terms of military mobilization or national decisions. This means that His Majesty must obtain the full support of all the suzerains, especially from the 6 great clans and the 13 distinguished families. This will definitely come at a price. Thales' heart shuddered. A price, like the next candidate for the Supreme of Constellation? As such, there are pros and cons to battle. Not only will it bring about danger, it will also cause Constellation's influence of power to change. Once they go through the baptism of battle, the weak will be cast off, the old will lose their positions, the strong will live, and the living will become even stronger. Some of the suzerains will have death on their heads, and the other half will have new lives. Under Gilbert's brightly burning eyes, Thales sat in the carriage with a dumbfounded expression as he felt the jerks and lurches of the carriage. Lastly, there are no children within the royal family. It has been 12 years since Constellation is without an heir. Gilbert's voice suddenly rose. What danger lurking on the country's doorstep could possibly force His Majesty to select an heir ahead of time so that he could have a backup plan for the country due to possible war? In fact, what if a family with great reputation does an act that complies with public trust and gathers the support from small noble families? Who knows whether they would become the next Jade Star and the next royal family? Silence. Thales looked outside the window with glazed eyes. He understood what Gilbert meant. However, he had been shocked by the frightening truth that had required him exercise his mind vigorously for, he could not get over it even after a long time. Gilbert saw his expression and shook his head lightly. Let's hope that this brutal and bloody game that has lasted for thousands of years will not scare off this intelligent and talented young man. After some time, Thales hoarsely spoke, so, this isn't just Extet's one-sided desire to fight and change their king. It is also the desire of many people in Constellation, to get rid of the royal family. He added his conclusion with much difficulty. The diplomat group's assassination is something that happened because of the various political factors working together, like when both ambitious parties in the two countries coordinate together. Is that right? The last few words Thales uttered were a statement. Gilbert looked at his condition worriedly. In his hesitation, he blinked, but he still said, with the royal family's current situation, your existence and subsequent appearance to the public will make you a target whether it is in national or international terms, both represented by the suzerains in the country or Extet, respectively. For the sake of your safety, I will suggest to His Majesty to postpone acknowledging your... Is it worth it? Thales did not bother with Gilbert's words. He spoke softly as he interrupted the middle-aged noble. Gilbert lifted an eyebrow. Thales asked powerlessly, just what sort of person would look forward so eagerly for war to come? This isn't some game of chess where we take each other's pieces and count our points by how many pieces we take. Thales closed his eyes slowly and clenched his fists. This is a war. There are living, breathing humans on both sides. They're standing right before each other, and they're taking each other's lives lawfully until one side completely dies. It's war. They've gone through the catastrophe that is the bloody year. Why are people still eager for war? Just for a crown? To enjoy the feeling of having influence and power in your hands in a broken and decaying kingdom, in an infertile land with starving people, and among extremely numbed people? And then they will rule for 20-something years in great difficulty, bleakness, trepidation, and paranoia, before they forcefully pass this misfortune to their descendants? Is it worth it? Gilbert wanted to answer, but he found himself at a loss for words for a time. Thales shook his head in low spirits as he did not obtain his answer. However, this might be what history was, the history of human actions. The coach fell into another round of silence. The carriage left the bustling King Street. More beggars appeared outside the carriage. Jins was forced to use the whip to scare them off. Gilbert looked at his student with a worried expression and said softly, this is not war. This is politics. We are all gamblers with winning power as the goals in mind. Land and people are simply bargaining chips that we can use in the exchange. Winning and losing is simply the transfer of bargaining chips. This is the game between nobles and countries. Thales lifted his gaze and giggled helplessly. Yes, war is the continuation of politics, a Game of Thrones, a feast for the crows. But I don't like this. Thales thought to himself in a quiet murmur. The transmigrator shifted his peripheral vision to the view outside the carriage window. There, a beggar with a distressed look extended a hand, feeling the wheel axle. Seeing this group of beggars in the capital, Thales contemplated, this kingdom is already in tatters. Wait. As the carriage passed a brightly burning everlasting lamp, Thales' eyes gained focus, and he instantly saw that beggar's hand clearly. The pair of hands were rough and riddled with calluses. But the calluses were not evenly distributed in the areas that he was used to seeing in the laborers' or beggars' hands, which were at the areas where they usually used their palms to touch or carry heavy items. Instead, they were concentrated on the thumb and index finger, as well as near where the former and latter fingers connected. The cogwheels in Thales' brain began turning. He had seen the same unique calluses on someone else's hands before. Jayla Charlton. Thales was stunned. He turned to another beggar, then the third, the fourth, Gilbert. The middle-aged noble looked over with a puzzled expression. He could only hear Thales' quiet voice say, something's wrong, these are not beggars. The transmigrator sucked in a deep breath. They are. Yodel's hoarse voice traveled faintly through the air and completed his sentence. Assassins. Chapter 52, Thales and Zayn, 2. White Eagle family's reaction is faster than we have imagined. The Iron Eagle reached Eternal Star City 2 hours ago. This will give His Majesty a lot of time for prior preparation even before the news spreads. Zayn elegantly sat in a carriage that bore no crest and was driven by Knight Seychelles. He spoke those words with a cold countenance and looked outside the carriage window. Another carriage with an equally mysterious identity stopped alongside them. The windows of both carriages were open to make it easier for their owners to converse. So what? No matter how fast a fish swims, it will not be able to avoid the current. This is a fated current His Majesty must face. A shrill voice rang from the other carriage. But there is a problem to our information, Zayn said coldly. There is an unexpected, important personage in the diplomat group. The consequences are direr than we have imagined. You want to give up? Zayn paused for a moment and took a deep breath. No, not at all. The plan will continue. There is no way to turn back now, is there? The shrill voice said nonchalantly, good, then. The general edict has already been issued. The nobles will be arriving one by one soon. During that time, Extet's official response would probably have arrived, to mobilize the army, claim territory, and threaten war. Guess how His Majesty would react? To swallow the humiliation for a greater cause, or to send our kingdom into hell with no regards for anything? And to conduct something this major, all of you are really ruthless. Zayan lowered his head, sighed and then shook his head lightly. Just like your family motto, power from violence. This is a necessary step. I must confirm your attitude and stance, you kept refusing to participate in New Star, and this has made us very perplexed. The other voice laughed loudly. It seems like you are very confident in yourself. I cannot blame you for that. Think about this, for the young, elegant and well-mannered Zayan Kovendir, the mayor of Jade City and the guardian duke of South Coast, to be made heir by His Majesty. Such a marvelous scene. Zayan said in earnest sincerity, we are willing to promise with our family's honor that your people's rule in the Western Desert will not be shaken by anyone. All of you might even benefit from the decay of the Northern Territory. And it is not necessarily myself, Constellation might also adopt the King's selection system, is that not so? He spoke slowly and softly as he leaned forward slightly, and as one of the 6, you are bound to be a candidate. A silence of more than 10 seconds descended between the two carriages. The shrill voice said slyly, very well, from this moment on, you have my assurance. If Constellation comes to that, without any accident, the Fake and his family will definitely become a force to be reckoned with. Zayan softly clenched his fists. He suppressed the impatience in his heart. This man, still unwilling to rashly place his bet. He can't be thinking that Faken has a chance, too? Or is he simply swinging to the other few families? Cullen? Nanchester? Or the very impossible T-Bark? I will remember it, Faken has stance, the master of tricolor Isis flowers said plainly. Even though Zayan kept his composure, he dreaded the person in the other carriage very much. In his list, this man's threat level was only behind the plump guardian duke of the Eastern Sea, and surpassed Nanchester's one-eyed dragon. The shrill voice laughed loudly again and continued to speak, I am greatly honored, Zayan, soon to be your majesty. I heard that lately, you have been deeply bothered by the matters of Blood Bottle Gang. Are you people not working together to control the gangs? The old man from the Cullen family is just standing idly like this? Having heard the words your majesty, Zayan frowned and pouted obscurely. Thank you for your concern, everything is under control. This will be all for today, I still need to head to Renaissance Palace. As for you, you should be in the ruins right now to personally receive His Majesty's edict. Do not concern yourself. Faken is never absent. The shrill voice suddenly became cold. Very well, Sir Faken. I look forward to seeing you again, Zayan uttered one last sentence. The shrill voice laughed and said, yes. I look forward to it too, the reunion of the 19 noble families in the capital city, after 12 years, ha. The two carriages began moving respectively and went in opposite directions, going further and further away from each other. Zayan lowered his head and shut his eyes, massaging his nose bridge gently. Seychelles' voice rang from the front window. Sir, something is wrong up ahead. Zayan gently opened his eyes. A distance away outside the carriage, intense and strange sharp sounds rang. Seychelles let go of the whip with one hand and held the sword at his waist. He spoke coldly, it seems like a carriage is being attacked by assassins. Keep calm. Looking at the beggars on both sides of the street, whether lying down or standing, Gilbert leaned forward with an indifferent countenance and opened a little window in front of the coach. After hesitating for a moment, he softly spoke in a steady tone, Madam Jins, there is an anomaly around us. From the little window, Thales could clearly see that Jin's figure trembling. She slowly spoke, assassins? Coming for the child? For some reason, Thales could detect some unstable emotions from Jin's words. He also noticed Gilbert looking worriedly at Jin's figure. Might not be, the middle-aged noble said softly. Might not be? Thales checked for JC's dagger at his waist. Having heard this, he could not help but become panic-stricken. But even Yodel confirmed that they are assassins. Why is Gilbert telling Jins that it might not be? Prepare to increase the speed and break away at any time. But before they really take action, Jins, you must keep calm. You must. Remember, they might not be assassins, the middle-aged noble spoke very solemnly. He seemed to realize that what he said to Jins did not sound quite right, and immediately added another sentence. Yodel, you as well. Are they coming for me? Thales asked with a somber countenance. Gilbert sat down, surveyed the carriage with a sharp gaze and softly said, the situation is unclear for now. Theoretically, it is impossible for your existence and whereabouts to be divulged. But please prepare for the worst. Even though he could not be seen, Yodel's raspy voice echoed strangely beside his ears. At least 7 of them. Skilled in hiding and well-trained, placed along the road leading to Renaissance Palace. I am prepared and will increase the speed any time. Sit tight. Jin's voice rang, sending a chill down Thales' spine when he heard it. Jins, calm down. Even Gilbert seemed a little off. He said these words to Jins solemnly. At that moment, even the most inexperienced Thales could feel that something was not right with Jins. The carriage rounded a corner, traversing from mud road to brick road. They would be reaching the central region after 2 more turns. Then, an old beggar who was just groaning on the floor to their left suddenly changed his expression. He chased them on all fours and came up beside one of the horses. He extended his hands towards Jin's and begged. Crack! There was a whipping sound and the entire carriage then sped up without warning, rocking vigorously. Gilbert's countenance changed greatly. He pounced towards the front part of the carriage and without caring about Thales' reaction, loudly shouted, Jins, no! Wait! However, it was too late. Jins shouted furiously from the driving seat. Come! Shameless people! Along with the sharp turn of Jin's wrist, the whip hit the old beggar's body and rang furiously. Snap! The force was great and a trickle of blood flew from the beggar's body. Along with his blood, the old beggar flew 5 meters away. A scimitar fell from his sleeve. When the stunned Thales was still trying to figure out what happened, a beggar behind the carriage suddenly leaped with a dagger in his hands. He cried furiously, it happened. Attack! From among the beggars and squatters, more than 10 figures pounced towards the carriage. Thales' countenance changed drastically. There were more than 7 assassins. Unfortunately, when he was able to count the number of assassins clearly, the enemy had already commenced the attack. The 2 horses were the first to be assaulted. While rolling past the carriage, 2 assassins cut through the horses' stomachs. Blood splattered out together with the sad cries of the black steeds. Amid Jin's furious yells and whipping, the carriage continued moving forward from the inertia, but then immediately ran onto the fallen horses. The entire coach began to roll towards its side. Jins leaped up forcefully and whipped an assassin beside her. The assassin fell back on the ground. Her countenance was frenzied. Clenching her teeth, she pulled out the long sword from her waist and turned back around, thrusting it into the left chest of an assassin behind her. Thump! The coach finally fell onto its side on the road. The moment the carriage fell, Thales was hugged tightly by Gilbert and sheltered under his body. Along with the movement of the carriage, they fell beside the window. 3 assassins leaped onto the overturned coach. As Thales dizzily got onto his feet, Gilbert pressed him to the side. Crack! It was not the assassins, but Gilbert, who began attacking. Calmly, he pulled out his staff, raised his arm and waved it, completely shattering the glass window above them. Shards of glass flew upwards. The 3 assassins subconsciously raised their arms to protect their eyes. Gilbert's staff extended outwards like a poisonous snake. A sharp blade popped out of the tip of the staff and executed precise strikes. Holding his neck, an assassin fell. Thales held his head tightly. He could feel tiny shards of glass falling around him. 2 long swords extended into the coach and aimed for Thales. However, they were deflected by the noble rapier in Gilbert's left hand with marvelous skill and strength. Slash! One blade thrust into the sofa on Thales' left and another swept past his right arm, thrusting into the air. Thales clenched his teeth, feeling the icy-cold sensation on his right arm. One of the assassins saw the situation inside the coach. He spoke in surprise, no. However, before the assassin could finish, he was cut off. Yodel appeared behind the 2 assassins like a ghost and cut through their necks from the back with a dark-colored short sword. The 2 shabbily dressed assassins immediately went limp and plopped down. Take him away! Gilbert growled furiously. Shielding off the falling shards of glass, he pressed on the coach and flung himself out of the carriage. Yodel grabbed Thales' belt and fished him out of the coach. Between Jin's furious growls, Thales saw the situation around him clearly. Under the illumination of eternal lamps, 7 or 8 assassins who were dressed as beggars dragged their long shadows and pounced towards the overturned carriage. Passers-by ran off in the midst of shrill screams and wails. The street was suddenly in chaos. Gilbert kicked a piece of carriage debris at the nearest assassin. He then forced back a knife-wielding assassin to his left with 2 swords. Yodel moved quickly and slashed open the throat of an assassin who pounced towards him. He then enveloped Thales in his embrace. As he prepared to enter the path of shadows, something strange happened. Crack dash! A shrill explosion rang through the air. Yodel's hand suddenly released Thales. Crack! It was an extremely high-pitched, piercing sound. At that moment, Thales clenched his molars in pain. He felt as though the sound was making his head explode. Damn! What is this sound? He subconsciously covered his ears. However, that intense sound was like magic, crawling into his brain regardless of any obstructions. Crack! The sound was still continuing. Jins and Gilbert seemed to be greatly affected, their faces distorted, and they moved contortedly. Amid the quaking, Jins even cut her left arm on a blade. Screech! The magic sound became more and more intense. Yodel trembled, trying to resist the invasion of the sound. His head was lowered and Thales knew that he was speaking. However, the transmigrator could not hear it at all as his mind was filled with the tormenting sound. Thales narrowed his eyes, enduring the pain in his eardrums and covering his ears with all his might. When he raised his head, he was shocked to see that the assassins could still move freely, although they looked like they were in pain. 5 of them extended their hands towards their backs and took out a weapon. They aimed their weapons at Thales and the masked protector. Crossbows. A surge of coldness passed through Thales' heart. He did not doubt anymore that this was a carefully planned assassination. The strings of the crossbows vibrated at the same time. In the thick of the magic sound, the pull of the bowstrings on the crossbows could not be heard. However, 5 elongated black shadows appeared in Thales' sight at the same time. The next moment, Thales was thrown a few meters away by Yodel. Screech! Amid the tormenting magic sound and the squall, Thales saw with despair that the black shadows were shooting at the masked protector. As Thales twirled, he saw Yodel's figure suddenly tremble. No. Yodel, Yodel Cato, Thales thought fearfully. Thales fell on the ground, then tumbled twice. Screech, the magic sound became nearer and nearer. He covered his ears, and managed to stand up, in pain and trembling. However, there was a shabbily dressed figure in front of him. It was an unkempt, young beggar who had a delicate and childish appearance. He was not much older than Thales. His lips were parted and vibrated at a high frequency. As he approached, the sound also neared. With a cold countenance, the beggar took out a dagger from his waist. Thales, who was clenching his teeth and enduring the magic sound, understood something. Based on the instinct he had acquired after practicing for almost a month, he subconsciously placed his right foot to the back and raised his left arm. He then shifted his weight backwards and assumed the standard Northland military sword-style position. One of the 3 defense styles, iron body style. Amid the magic sound, the dagger quickly thrust towards him and pierced through his left arm. Pain invaded Thales. He clenched his teeth, knowing he had made the right choice. The young beggar was a little stunned, but he immediately widened his mouth at Thales. As his lips and tongue vibrated, the magic sound became even higher pitched. Screech. The sensation at that split second made Thales shut his eyes tightly. He shouted wildly and futilely, almost feeling like digging his eardrums out. Amid the intensely vibrating air, it was as though every single cell on Thales' body began trembling. He felt himself becoming hot, like food heated up with a microwave. Stop. He quickly retracted his arms and instinctively covered his ears. Stop. The dagger was pulled out of his left arm with a splattering of blood. Stop. Thales pulled his face in pain, kneeling down surrounded by the terrifying magic sound. Stop. The dagger was thrust towards his throat again. Quickly stop. At the last moment, Thales opened his eyes in despair and saw that the young assassin's cold-blooded face was slowly distorting into another blurred face. It was a girl with long eyelashes. She widened her bright eyes and looked at him curiously. Your name is Wu Qiren. What a weird name. My name? Why don't you guess? The transmigrator trembled and extended his hand towards the bleary face. Excitement and boiling heat simultaneously rushed into his heart. He suddenly felt pain in his left shoulder, and the magic sound ringing beside his ears became louder, making the girl's subsequent words inaudible. Her blurred lips opened and closed. Stop. He muttered without realizing it. Stop. I can't hear her anymore. Stop. His extended hand suddenly made a grabbing motion, and it was as if he grabbed something out of thin air. Stop. He muttered. And then, the magic sound really stopped. His head no longer felt as if in disorder. His eardrums were not in pain anymore. And the scene in front of his eyes returned to normal as Thales tremblingly opened his eyes. The dagger that thrust at his throat was now lodged in his left shoulder. While the owner of the dagger, the young assassin, held onto the handle and kneeled, devoid of energy. Facing him, the young assassin collapsed into Thales' embrace. The corner of his lips convulsed and his whole body trembled. Thales looked at him in bewilderment. The young assassin's face became paler and paler. He stared into Thales' eyes, his gaze filled with bewilderment and confusion. Why? Thales could read this message from his gaze. Gasping heavily and enduring the pain in his shoulder, Thales stared at him in surprise. The transmigrator also wanted to know why, only a moment ago, the murderous psionic assassin, Wait. This is? Thales held the young man as he panted and lowered his head. The transmigrator held up his warm right hand in the space between their arms and bodies. He looked at the warm and wet thing in his hand as he trembled. It was an irregularly shaped red ball. There were a lot of tubes sticking out of it. It seemed to be trembling too? Thales focused his gaze. He saw it clearly. His gray pupils immediately contracted. In Thales' past life, he did not do very well in his high school biology classes. After entering university and becoming a postgraduate student, his biology knowledge decayed even more rapidly. But that did not stop him from recognizing the object in his hand. It was a blazing hot, still beating, blood-red and wet, heart. The blood vessel between its two atriums, unable to absorb any blood, convulsed abruptly. Thales subconsciously looked towards his chest, then looked at the young assassin's chest. However, their chests were both whole and unharmed, without a single drop of blood. Ba-bump, ba-bump, the heart beat softer and softer. Slower and slower. After being stunned for a few seconds, Thales trembled suddenly. The bloody, fresh heart slid from his hands and dropped between the young assassin's knees. The young assassin's breathing became weaker and weaker. Pale-faced, it was as though he recognized his fate. Lucy! He groaned lethargically beside Thales' ear. That was his final word. Until he stopped moving. Thales could finally hear the sound of fighting beside him again. His entire body trembling, the transmigrator extended his hand that was drenched in warm blood. He endured the pain and, with great effort, pulled out the dagger from his left shoulder. He threw it aside without looking at it and escaped from the young assassin while rolling and crawling. The young assassin's corpse fell face down powerlessly. He pressed down on that heart. His own heart. What is this? Did I lose control again? Thales shuddered and remembered Yodel, who was surrounded and attacked by bows and arrows. He instinctively turned his head around, but aside from the assassins' corpses beside the carriage, there was nothing else. Thales was still in pain. His ears twitched from the sound. Another assassin fell beside him. At the instant the magic sound disappeared, the assassins noticed the bizarre situation in the corner. As Gilbert and Jins continued their efforts to hold them back, someone finally freed himself and rushed over to provide assistance. The assassin that came over as support looked at the boy lying on the ground in shock, then looked at Thales before he flung his right hand without hesitation. A hidden blade under his wrist appeared. Thales reached out towards JC's dagger and thought about the possibilities between defending and fleeing. Perhaps. He cast a glance at the young assassin's corpse. I can use that power. Right at that moment, intense pain burst forth all over Thales' body. Irk. Thales grit his teeth and fell to the side. It was as if someone was ripping his soul apart. No. No. However, the assassin did not bother with his condition. He only thrust his hidden blade towards Thales coldly, but at that moment, Thales could not even be bothered worrying about the safety of his own life. He had never experienced this sort of pain before. It was as if every single part of his body was crying out in protest. Ah! In the end, Thales could not handle the excruciating pain, which made him feel as if he was being tortured. He screamed, convulsing, and could only watch as the enemy's hidden blade attacked him. Is this the end? So painful. So painful. That strength is truly not without consequences. However, stab. Right before the assassin managed to have his attack land, a tall and slender figure appeared behind him. Before the assassin could even manage to turn around, a long sword that came charging towards him pierced through his brain. Thales, who collapsed on the floor, lifted his head while on the verge of death. A young, round-faced noble with elegant movements and who paid great attention to detail with his clothes, walked forth from behind the assassin. The young noble frowned, then wiped off the liquid on his sword on the assassin's clothes. The pain receded like a tidal wave. When he felt that the pain had temporarily faded, Thales sucked in a sharp breath like a drowning man. He looked at the noble's shoulder, and then a shiver so strong that it caused even his vision to sway racked his body. There was an embroidered, complicated, flower-patterned heraldry. Thales recognized it. Red, blue, green, 3 petals. Tricolor iris flower. Chapter 53, Send them into the palace. That extreme pain that began from the inside of the body and extended to the outside had already disappeared from Thales' body. Pressing on the wound on his left arm and shoulder, Thales panted with difficulty and looked at the young noble before him. Thank you. A distance away, Lord Seychelles' sword sparkled. He nimbly finished off the last assassin. Near the overturned carriage, Jin shrugged away Seychelles' supporting hand. With a cold expression, she walked towards an assassin on the floor who was not completely dead yet. Under the knight's furrowed brows, she exerted great strength and thrust her sword between the assassin's eyes. The unrelated passers-by had already escaped and dispersed. Amid the chaos and dead bodies on the street, Thales could not find the masked protector's figure. He could only hope that he survived the double attack of the magic sound and the arrows. After all, Yodel was a supreme-class elite. On the floor, the exhausted Gilbert looked towards their direction anxiously. However, ever since he saw the iris flower emblem, Thales knew that his most urgent task at hand was to deal with the young noble who saved his life, along with his follower, the knight who could defeat the assassins with ease, and was obviously not a simple retinue. Iris flower. Gilbert had only started educating Thales on noble heraldry and their emblems. However, this did not prevent him from understanding the meaning behind this emblem. When he was kidnapped by the Blood Clan, the waving flag in Vine Manor told Thales that whatever family the flower symbolized, it probably did not have very good feelings towards the Jadestar royal family. Those people. Thales' face was panic-stricken, just like a typical 7-year-old child who had just faced danger and had not calmed down yet. He spoke fearfully, those people suddenly just pounced towards us. This child could travel together with the king's lover and his closest attendant, who was also the former foreign affairs minister. Zayan thought, and was almost assassinated on the way to the central region. Who is he? Could he be an unforeseen circumstance who might affect the plan? Child, do not be afraid, it is all right now. The young, round-faced noble smiled and placed his sword back into its sheath. Looking at the 7-year-old boy, he elegantly said, assassins are creatures that live in the dark. Away from the dark, they are completely harmless and are good for nothing. I am Zayan Kovandir, one of the thousands of nobles in this kingdom. As long as I am around, I will not allow them to hurt you. And child, may I know who you are? Zayan asked politely and raised his brows. Me? Beneath his shaken appearance, Thales took a deep breath and contemplated the situation at hand. I have not made an official appearance, and am not recognized as a Jadestar yet. However, I am definitely a thorn in the flesh of those nobles who have the potential to be crowned. Before reaching the palace, I must not reveal my identity. Thales looked towards Gilbert. When Gilbert saw Zayan, even his hat fell. The former foreign affairs minister's body was shaky and covered in injuries. However, he braced himself with his staff and limped from afar. He's still a distance away, and can't explain on my behalf, Thales thought, but right now. He looked towards Zayan. With a skeptical gaze, the latter waited for his answer. Looking at Thales, who did not utter a single word, Zayan's suspicions grew. The young duke glanced around and saw Gilbert, who was some distance away. Is he hesitating? Or does he indeed have a fishy identity and is waiting for Queso to come to his rescue? Are you waiting for Count Queso? Zayn smiled. To be personally escorted by the kingdom's most outstanding foreign affairs minister ever, you seem like you have quite the background, child. Having felt Zayn's suspicions, the boy knew that he could not bluff his way through anymore. Otherwise, even if Gilbert helped conceal his identity, the noble with the iris flower emblem would not easily believe it. I am Thales. Thales searched through his memory for his supposed identity and adapted it to his current circumstances. With the kind of fear that can only be found in a 7-year-old child, he slowly said, they all say that I am Lord Mon's illegitimate child. Mon? Zayn's gaze flickered. The kingdom's warrior in the Desert War, Lord Soren Mon, who died in combat at the Western Front Line a year ago? The frontline charger, Mon's illegitimate child? Hasn't Mon's territory and manor already been taken back? He frowned slightly. Thales was slowly sweating from his palms. Gilbert only told him about the basic state of affairs in Mon Manor. He never told him about what sort of person Lord Mon was. I don't know, they don't really tell me about my father, Thales said sadly as he lowered his head. Gilbert finally arrived in front of them. With a shocked and worried expression, the former foreign affairs minister trembled as he bowed towards Zayn. Thank you for your generous help. I did not expect to see you here, Duke Covendir. Zayn immediately took a step forward and held on to Gilbert, whose body was full of injuries and was on the verge of collapsing. This time, his gaze was especially earnest. Count Queso, I would prefer to encounter you on another occasion and talk as we drink, rather than this despicable assassination where I lend you a helping hand, he said earnestly. Zayn quietly recalled the identity of this man. Count Gilbert Queso, the cunning fox of Constellation. This was how other kingdoms, with Extet starting with it, addressed Count Queso after the Fortress Treaty I was formed. At the time, he was still a viscount who recently inherited his father's title. This is adequate proof of the man's wisdom and tactics. 12 years ago, as Constellation's negotiator, he skillfully maneuvered the conference table between kingdoms and thwarted the Great Dragon of the North's intentions to push southwards. He was also the first noble who was promoted from viscount to count purely on the basis of diplomatic achievements. When news spread that the negotiation was successful, almost all of Constellation celebrated wildly. They joyously celebrated the end of the bloody year. If it weren't for political reasons, Gilbert, who was unbeatable in the political scene at the time, would have most certainly become King Kessel's next prime minister. That old Cullen wouldn't have stood a chance. He is a rare talent in Constellation. If one day I become, he would be of great help. Zayn contemplated. Zayn quickly put on a stern and serious expression. I will instruct the police station to not let go of this sordid assassination, no matter the reason. The perpetrator must pay the price. Similarly, Gilbert was also surmising the young duke from one of the 6 great clans, the Covendir family, and whom was promoted only 2 years ago. 2 years ago, when the old duke passed away in that regrettable family tragedy, everyone thought that the visibly declining Covendir family, along with the prosperous South Coast Hill, would be scattered and divided due to the endless internal strife. His Majesty had even written an edict after reaching an agreement with the other families, preparing to intervene in this internal family strife to obtain benefits. That was until this young duke, who at the time was rumored to be at odds with his family, returned from his travels in the faraway eastern peninsula. Facing pressure from 3 of his powerful cousins and to the surprise of all the nobles, Zayn reunited tricolor iris flowers in the south coast, making them one of the most honorable families and one of the most affluent powers in Constellation once more. Gilbert chose his words carefully. Sir Covendir, I will always remember your kind deed. However, before that, I have to. At that moment, Thales, who was beside them, suddenly spoke up and interrupted their respective thoughts. Sir Queso, as the 2 men looked at him, the 7-year-old Thales sadly lowered his head and said in a reluctant tone, I don't feel like inheriting Mon Manor anymore. The tired Gilbert's gaze flickered. Thales, he is reminding me, he thought. I am only an illegitimate child who has only seen my father's face a few times. I don't have many rights anyway. And... Thales tremblingly raised his head, his eyes were filled with frightened tears. What happened just now? I don't want to experience it again. I just want to be the Thales without a family name again. Gilbert sighed. With Zayn staring at him, his eyes shone. Child, I understand what you are feeling. To be caught in the whirlwind of inheritance will never be a pleasant memory. We are truly grateful of your help, Your Grace. However, this is His Majesty's order. Your Grace, we must rush to Renaissance Palace immediately. Standing aside, Jins finished bandaging up her wounds and walked towards them with an unpleasant expression, cutting off their conversation. She did not dare to actually look at Thales and Gilbert. Instead, with an overbearing expression, she insisted on leaving. However, as she was about to grab Thales, Seychelles stopped her arm midair. The latter looked at the young duke without any emotion on his face and waited for his decision. Zayn narrowed his eyes and spoke with considerable grace. Forgive me for interrupting. So, this boy, Thales, is going to inherit the Mon family assets? Gilbert looked at Thales with a complicated gaze. This is a task from His Majesty, and we were not supposed to disclose it. However, since the Master of Tricolor Iris Flowers is inquiring. Gilbert sighed and nodded. His Majesty ordered us to bring this child before him, so that his father's inheritance, including the Mon Manor, can be transferred to him. You know Lord Mon emerged as a power to be reckoned with during the Desert War, and had a deep friendship with His Majesty during his lifetime. After he died in combat, all his territories and assets were committed to the royal family's care, until someone discovered his illegitimate child. Gilbert continued to weave the lie without batting an eyelid. Obviously, there is a party that is not very satisfied with Lord Mon's heir. Gilbert looked at the ground that was littered with the assassin corpses and put on a worried face. You know, the manor is extremely large. And after Lord Mon rose to power, a lot of relatives appeared out of thin air. Zayan stared at Thales, his gaze was frozen on the boy for 2 seconds. The orphan illegitimate son of the hero? To enter Renaissance Palace? To receive a title from His Majesty and inherit his father's wealth? At this time? He glanced at Jins. And, with the company of the head of female officials, who was also His Majesty's lover. A distance away, bustling noises and synchronized, advancing footsteps could be heard. The city defense team and police force had finally arrived. Jin's composure was obviously anxious while Gilbert maintained his visage. However, Thales knew that Gilbert definitely did not want him exposed under the public eye. Even if it was with the identity of Lord Mon's illegitimate son. As the other 3 were anxiously waiting, Zayan suddenly flashed a smile. I see, no wonder His Majesty placed so much emphasis on this. Lord Mon was not only His Majesty's battle companion, but also Constellation's hero. His kin most definitely should not be left to deal with ugly conspiracies. Thales breathed a sigh of relief. Zayan then said worriedly, however, both of you are quite heavily injured. Fortunately, the city defense team and police force are here. The 2 of you can obtain treatment and assistance from them, and must also explain what happened in the assassination clearly from start to finish. Zayan spoke plainly, as for this child, since it is His Majesty's order, you can entrust him to me. I am heading towards Renaissance Palace. Gilbert and Jin's expressions changed. Your Grace. That is too much trouble for you. Gilbert's looked stern as he spoke decisively, and this is my duty. This child's safety should be the top priority. He has already survived an assassination. Zayan said, his tone filled with emotion. He kneeled on one knee and tore out a piece of cloth from his sleeve, bandaging Thales' wounds. And the hero's orphan deserves this from me. Thales' expression became stiff. Zayan thought coldly, this excuse is too clumsy. To dispatch his most trusted attendant and his lover to fetch the orphan of a low-level noble at such a pivotal moment? Even though that noble is the king's battle companion whom had experienced life and death scenarios together. There must be something suspicious about that boy. Zayan nodded at them while as he smiled, putting on an expression that told them not to worry. With tricolor iris flower's name and Seychelles' ability, he will definitely be safe. Sensing Zayan's gaze, Thales felt a surge of coldness run up his upper back. Zayan Kovendir. Jins furiously took a step forward, but was halted by Seychelles and his sword. Step back, madam. The Supreme Class Knight did not budge at all, his gaze was cold. This is the Duke's will, and also my mission. Gilbert's brows were furrowed very tightly. Facing the Duke and the Supreme Class Knight, he anxiously thought of ways to handle the situation. Sir Kovendir. This is not appropriate. Gilbert had never spoken with such a stern tone before, this is His Majesty's. My respect towards His Majesty cannot be doubted by anyone. Zayan said loudly, staring intently at Thales, however, it is obvious that my carriage and guard are more suitable for His Majesty's duty compared to all of you, who are covered in injuries. Zayan turned his head, and his words were foreboding. Or is it because all of you are hiding something else from me? Gilbert was momentarily at a loss for words while Jins threw a cold glare and held the handle of the sword at her waist tightly, she was already prepared to snatch Thales back. Thales also became anxious. Follow this person? How is that possible? But due to Yodel's disappearance, using brute force would only be counterproductive. What do I do? Thales frantically contemplated all the possible solutions, including the power within himself. What do I do? Having seen the 3 people's reactions, Zayan was even surer of his own assumptions. He smiled, a little mockingly, child, you don't have to be anxious. His Majesty is known for being righteous and impartial. And since you are Lord Mon's heir, is it not perfectly justified for you to inherit your father's assets? You should be proud of your father, his brave assault in that sacrificial battle rescued us from the entire desert war. Please allow me to escort you as a sign of my respect towards the hero. Seeing Zayan's bright smile, Thales felt his skin crawl, he could not think of a strategy. It seemed that the solemn Gilbert and the anxious Jins could not think of one either. The corner of Zayan's lips curled up. He stood up and extended his right hand as a sign of invitation. Please go ahead, young Sir Thales. Thales took a deep breath and glanced at the middle-aged noble and the female official. It seems that there's no other way. At this moment, the people who made those synchronized footsteps finally entered their field of vision. There were at least a dozen skilled warriors, who were completely silent and moved with precision. They were equipped with iron armors, long swords, silver shields, steel helmets, and even mystic guns and specialized infantry crossbows. Grand and magnificent, they walked into the scene in synchrony and surrounded everyone there. Everyone's expressions changed at the same time. Seychelles was the first one to clearly see the equipment and emblem on those warriors. With an unpleasant expression, he went near the Duke and said in a low voice, they are not from the police force and the city defense team. They are the royal guards. Zayan's countenance immediately turned extremely unpleasant. Gilbert and Jins both clearly saw the person who led the murderous, skilled warriors. Both of their faces relaxed. That person was a short figure wearing a cloak, the head and face tightly wrapped up. In the name of constellations. Thales then noticed that the voice beneath the cloak belonged to a young woman. The short and small figure took a step forward and scratched her head. In the name of that supreme king. However, the owner of that voice seemed to be unfamiliar with the situation, and was also a little unacquainted with this manner of speech. She continued shouting, in the name of Kukeskessel, what was it, Jada, it's so hard to pronounce. In short, in the name of your king. Under Thales' stunned gaze, the short and small figure placed her hand on her hip, then raised a hand and pointed, one by one, at the people there, speaking furiously, take Madame Jins, that grey-faced uncle, and that little brat, and send all of them to his palace. Chapter 54, Sunset's spokesperson. Thales, who was quite heavily injured, was piggybacked by a member of the royal guards. Despite the dizziness from the rocking, he was advancing at the same speed as the battalion. The pain in his left shoulder and left arm roused him from his unconsciousness. Where am I? He shook his head with force. Thales only realized after a while that he could not think straight. He was escorted by the entire team of skilled royal guards, led by the cloaked woman, and advanced steadily amid their marching steps. On the other hand, Gilbert and Jins were walking alongside the cloaked woman. It seemed like they were conversing in a low voice. Thales inhaled deeply, and with fatigue weighing him down heavily, raised his head and looked around. They passed by a stately, grayish-black palace wall which was continuous, long and seemingly endless. The body of the wall was mottled with different hues and worn at some parts. It seemed to have been here for a long time. With synchronized steps, the royal guards reached a gigantic, steel portcullis that was controlled using complicated brake cables. Under more than 10 huge city defense ballistae atop of the palace wall, the royal guards were only allowed entry after exchanging secret codes with the sentries who kept a tight watch. Thales opened his mouth dumbfounded. He stared at the starlit and moon-bathed sky in a daze. The ground beneath his feet went from muddy road to coarse, stone floor, then to beautiful tiles specially paved by some unknown material. The everlasting lamps on both sides became increasingly larger, more intricate, and brighter. When they arrived, a magnificent, pyramid-shaped building that resembled a gigantic slope appeared abruptly before his eyes. Members of the royal guards were posted every few yards apart from each other, teams upon teams of patrol soldiers and busy servants nodded in greeting towards them. Thales suddenly realized that they had arrived at Eternal Star City's tallest, largest, most magnificent, and also most distinguished building. Thales' expression relaxed. He lowered his head again. When he awoke once more, it was the following morning. Thales realized that he was wearing a set of coarse pajamas and lying on a stone bed with a soft mattress on it. A little startled, he flexed his already bandaged left hand and left shoulder. Having felt that he was not doing too badly, he lightly leaped down from the stone bed and stepped on the floor that was made of a similar ice-cold stone material. The icy temperature and crude tactility could be felt from beneath his feet. Thales furrowed his brows. He took a few steps forward and touched the similarly cold stone wall as he sized up the place. The ceiling was not high, but it was, surprisingly, made of the same stone material as the wall, floor, and bed. It radiated with a faint chillness. He walked towards the windowsill and opened the wooden window. A cold wind poured in and made him tremble. Fortunately, the winter sun shone luxuriously from the tall stone windowsill and into the purely stone-made room. However, compared to the warm Mindy's hall, even the daytime and sunlight could not chase away the uncomfortably cold and wet feeling of this room. Just like an abandoned house. Thales' heart stirred, and he recalled the place he stayed at for 4 years. He looked out of the window. The boy immediately gasped. The moment he stuck his head out, he looked downwards and saw the ant-like crowds, carriages the size of nails, houses as small as chest lattices, and streets that looked like flying striations. Without doubt, this room was situated somewhere extremely high up, overlooking the capital city's fascinating scenery. Just like my past life, he told himself. At that moment, the only door, made of thick wood, in the room was pushed open. The first-grade female official, Jins Baskovic, appeared at the entrance. Madam Jins? Seeing a familiar person, Thales immediately felt a lot more at ease. Looks like you are recovering well. Jin's face was a little pale and she did not seem to have much energy. However, she was still strong enough to hold herself up. This is far more than well. Jins thought, he was just stabbed by a dagger yesterday and today, even orcs don't possess this ability to recover. She sighed. By the way, Jins Madam Jins. Out of anxiousness, Thales forgot to use honorifics. He hastily took a step forward. Yesterday, Yodel and Gilbert. Jins extended a hand and cut Thales off. She quietly said, don't worry. Gilbert is with His Majesty. They have something to take care of. As for Yodel, he is still alive. Still alive? Thales was stunned. Does it mean that? Jin seemed to have realized that her words were a little too much. She immediately corrected herself, he was struck by a few crossbow arrows and is recuperating now. Yesterday, it was also thanks to his timely warning to His Majesty's other secret protector that the royal guards could arrive in time. With complicated emotions, Thales sighed in relief. Fortunately, that wasn't the last time the masked protector lived. Thales then recalled his conversation with Yodel last night. The question that Yodel did not answer, and the myriad of doubts associated with him. Thales also thought of the innocent children who were killed in an abandoned house and his heart darkened. Why did Yodel just stand by and watch them die? Was it? Thales sighed. No matter what the answer to the question was, after last night's alarming and dangerous incident, and after Yodel sacrificed his life to save him, But the matter stuck to Thales' heart like a thorn, making him unable to forget. Thales knew that he would be unable to trust Yodel without any doubt or hostility anymore. He would no longer be able to trust him like when he first met him. Thales shook his head and shifted his attention back to Jin's words. Wait, the other secret protector? Thales thought of the young, cloaked woman. He kept this information in his mind. Before he could digest this, the thoughts in his mind jumped to another matter. And those assassins, and that Duke Covendier. Jin's gaze became stern, and it reminded Thales of those days where they trained vigorously. She said, that is not something that you should concern yourself over. Everything is already settled. Those questions will soon no longer be questions anymore, and you should believe in your father. My father? With difficulty, Thales recalled this unfamiliar term. It was not that he did not care, but from Red Street Market to Mindy's Hall, he had only met his supposed father only once. Not to mention that he had treated Thales in that strange manner. Thales clenched his fist lightly. Another question surfaced in his mind. What about you? Jins was slightly stunned. Me? Thales raised his head, took a deep breath, and put on a worried expression. Yes, what about you, Madame Jins? On the carriage. Watching Jin's increasingly unpleasant expression, Thales clenched his teeth and spoke, I noticed your anomaly, when facing those assassins, why were you, behaving so strangely? Thales saw that the normally calm and confident Jins was trembling slightly after hearing those words, as if she was recalling the most terrifying memory ever. Thales watched her in a daze. The female official's face twisted, and she looked as if she was struggling against her shivers while her face turned pale. Thales furrowed his brows. A few seconds later, Jins heaved a sigh and loosened all the tension on her face, looking like the usual cold female official once more. It was as though everything just now was an illusion. Jins stared at the bewildered Thales with a flat stare. This little brat is so sensitive. The female official snorted softly and spoke once again in a formal tone. However, her face became tired and bitter. I asked the servants to prepare hot water and breakfast. Tidy yourself up, we still have something important to do. As though nothing had happened, she is deliberating avoiding it. Thales furrowed his brows. However, Jins glared sternly at him, as if giving him a warning. Thales could only shrug. All right, then, wait. Servants? Thales was stunned for a moment. He immediately turned his head and looked around the room that resembled a coffin more than a bedroom. So, we are at. Jins nodded tiredly. Yes, you are at Eternal Star City's biggest and most important building, the Palace of Constellation's past Supreme Kings. Jins said the following name in a deadpan manner, Renaissance Palace. Thales opened his mouth wide and thought of the gigantic pyramid-shaped building he saw yesterday. No wonder the room is so high up. He then furrowed his brows and looked around. The mottled wall, dull color scheme, dim lighting, low heat, hard slab stone, rough floors, and narrow room. Compared to Mindy's Hall, this place looked like the slums. Jin saw Thales' gaze. What? Are you not used to it? She crossed her arms and observed Thales' expression with interest. No, it's not that. Thales immediately waved his hands and shook his head. He wanted to say something, but in the end, he only sighed and lowered his head. In truth, he wanted to say that he had the soundest sleep ever over the past 20-something days. The hard and cold bed along with the rough and uneven floor allowed Thales to feel a sense of security the soft bed and blanket in Mindy's Hall could not offer him. I see. Thales realized sadly. I slept best throughout my 4 years as a child beggar in the harsh and vicious abandoned house. However, by speaking the truth, Jins obviously assumed that he was being stubborn. She smiled gloomily. I know what you are thinking. You are right. The Supreme King's palace is not as magnificent, luxurious, intricate, and as stately as you have imagined. Jins walked towards the window and fixed her gaze on the countless citizens of the kingdom below the towering Renaissance Palace. It is the opposite, Renaissance Palace, which is the alleged center of the kingdom, could not even measure up to a normal citizen's room. The next moment, Thales saw in a daze that the arrogant, domineering and tough female official was speaking in a desolate tone, very narrow. Very tall. Very cold. Jins turned and looked at Thales with a complicated expression, she said, and very dark. Walking behind Jins Baskovic, and stepping on the hard and rough stone floor unique to Renaissance Palace, Thales passed by countless rooms that were similarly narrow, cold, and dim. Along the way, all the guards and servants they met lowered their heads in salutation when they saw Jins. The lighting in this pyramid-shaped palace was so bad that lamps had to be used during the day to illuminate some of the more remote corners. Due to the height, cold air kept seeping in through the cracks. The only redeeming feature of the place was that it was often hard for insects to survive in such places. The narrow walkway and low ceiling made the palace's atmosphere repressive and unpleasant. Sometimes, it almost seemed lifeless. This place. Thales stuck his tongue out and marveled inwardly. Does not look like a palace at all. It looks more like a mausoleum. Weren't the Egyptian pyramids from my past life a royal mausoleum that had countless years of ancient history buried beneath it? We have arrived. Jin suddenly stopped, speaking coldly and slowly. Arrived, where? Thales, whose mind had wandered just now, suddenly noticed that they had reached an empty and dim stone corridor. There was a double-hung door in front of them. Jins did not answer him. She only nodded at Thales with a profound expression. Go inside, child. Be more polite. What sort of? Before the stunned Thales could finish speaking, Jins pressed on the stone door and abruptly pushed it open. Boom! Thales watched the scene behind the stone door in shock. It was a dark room, and only a few corners were illuminated by everlasting lamps. The everlasting lamp in the center was held in the hands of a woman who had her back to him? While Thales was still in shock, he was pushed into the room by Jins. Boom! The stone door was closed shut. When Thales was finally able to stand steadily, he realized that he was locked by Jins inside this stone chamber. So it's you, brat? Right then, a wholesome, pleasant, gentle and charming voice rang from the center of the room. Thales turned his head in bewilderment and looked towards the woman, who had her back to him. Holding an everlasting lamp, the woman slowly turned. Thales' eyes brightened. It was an oval-faced beauty, with bright eyes and white teeth, appearing 30-something years old. Compared to the charming and mature Jins, she lacked a valiant and disciplined bearing. However, she was lovelier and more captivating. She had a dark-colored veil on her head and wore a robe adorned with half a red sun. Wait, half a red sun? Thales was stunned. You are Sunset Temple's priestess? Sunset Temple? Ha ha ha. The beauty chuckled lightly. However, not only did Thales not feel a single ounce of tenderness in the laughter, he even sensed a hint of coldness. Let me look at you carefully, brat. The beauty approached him leisurely, but Thales frowned, as he could not feel a single hint of warmth nor kindness from her. He could feel some sort of unsettling vibe from this woman. The lovely 30-year-old woman lowered her body before him and narrowed her eyes while observing Thales. As expected, you have a pair of gray irises, too, just like your mother. Mother? Thales was stunned for a moment. Did you know, sorry, madam, may I know if you knew my mother? He asked, bewildered. At the same time, he remembered Jin's instruction to be polite and immediately used honorifics. The lovely beauty curled her lips, and her gaze was aloof. Of course. Your mother, she is a formidable character who is not to be trifled with, didn't Kessel tell you? Thales' breath unconsciously became uneven and said a little awkwardly, no, madam. Apart from her name, my father never told me anything else. I see. All right, you may leave now. The lovely beauty chuckled coldly and shook the everlasting lamp in her hand. Their shadows flickered chaotically in the stone chamber. Tell Kessel that I'm ready. Is it over just like that? Jins, or that father of mine, made me come and see her, what does this mean? But he had to know. Because. Thales sucked in a deep breath. He was almost 100% sure that all the strange things about him were related to that mother of his with her questionable background. Thales inhaled deeply and bowed respectfully according to the etiquette taught by Jins. Madam, if you tell me more about my mother, I would be deeply grateful. The lovely beauty covered her mouth and chuckled lightly. However, her countenance immediately turned frigid, and she spoke with an icy tone, even your father didn't tell you. Why should I? Thales was immediately at a loss for words, but it was impossible for him to give up so easily, but this is my mother. I have the right to know. And I will repay you. The beauty only chuckled indifferently and turned around. But you're not my son, and I'm not obligated to tell you. And, I don't need you to repay me. Thales choked once again. From all the people he met, apart from his own father, he had never met such a person before. This she is even more stubborn than the king. However, a string of thoughts suddenly formed in his mind. More stubborn than the king? Thales' brain operated continuously. He had thought of something. He exhaled deeply and looked at that lovely beauty. I see. I know who you are now. The lovely beauty turned her head in astonishment. I heard my father and Gilbert talk about you before. Thales frowned deeply and recalled in his mind the memory of when he was first rescued by Yodel and brought to Mindy's hall. He said slowly, I remember now. You are Dash. Thales inhaled deeply and raised his left hand, seeing the faint scar on it. His expression was one of hesitation for a while, but he immediately spoke with resolution. You are the Bloodline lamp, the lamp used to search for my father's kin. You are the one who cast the divine art. You are Sunset Temple's head ritual master, Lycia. The lovely beauty Lycia's face immediately turned ugly and she said slowly, you are indeed your mother's son. You even inherited the entirety of her guile and good memory. You are right, I am Lycia Arundi, the head ritual master of Sunset Temple. The Sunset Goddess, one and only spokesperson in the world, and also the one who would be validating your status as someone who possesses royal blood. Chapter 55, She was a nightmare. It seems that my mother had once made you very troubled. Thales' expression was determined. He had resolved upon finding out the identity of his mysterious mother. Lycia chuckled lightly and scornfully. Then the lovely ritual master walked towards him with a terrifying gaze. Troubled? It's far more than that. She was a nightmare. Nightmare? Thales thought of Kessel the Fifth's coldness and disregard towards him and could not help but be stunned. You should leave, Kingdom's blood. Lycia coldly glared at Thales from above. I have met you, and your duty is done. Thales regained his attention and, clenching his teeth, took a step forward. Thurin Girana. Upon hearing this name, Lycia paused suddenly. The emotions in her gaze changed. Thales took a deep breath and continued speaking. This is my mother's name. I don't know what this name signifies to you, but no matter what kind of person she is, I need to know. Lycia lowered her head slightly and narrowed her eyes. Suddenly, Thales realized in astonishment that all the everlasting lamps there were shining brighter and brighter, brightly illuminating the dim stone chamber. The flames inside the lamps, which had been quiet and gentle, started making crackling sounds. Is this the divine arts? He clenched his left fist tightly. Lycia stared at Thales' gray eyes. Her frown became increasingly deeper. In the end, she waved her arm in disdain. You are indeed a continuation of that nightmare. Let me give you a piece of advice, stop asking anything about your damned mother. I won't tell you anything. Thales stared at Lycia with a dumbfounded gaze. But he still forced down his displeasure and said in an agitated tone, but you already told me. You told a son that his mother is a nightmare. Thales lifted his head and glared at Lycia's cold, black eyes, refusing to back down. I'm curious, just whose nightmare is she? My father's? Thales gritted his teeth and asked, or is she your nightmare? A piercing light suddenly exploded from Lycia's eyes. That was not a description, there was literally a golden light bursting out from her eyes. Thales was unable to open his eyes. He was so shocked that he took a step backwards and lifted his left hand to cover his eyes. His right hand touched JC's dagger. He felt horrible under that golden light. So this is the power that came from that so-called sunset goddess? Be careful of your words, mortal. As her eyes glowed with a powerful light, and her eyes and gaze became unclear. Lycia said flatly with a dignified expression, in this mortal world, no one knows more than I do about how despicable and hateful your mother is. Thales stared at her blankly. She is a cold, cruel, treacherous, deceitful whore who was insane and obsessed over influence and power. Every single one of her actions had an ugly motive that cannot be disclosed to others. Remember my words, forget her completely, or else there will come a day when you will regret this. Thales walked down a few steps absent-mindedly, trailing behind Jinns on a path in Renaissance Palace on whichever floor, he did not know. He could not let go of what Lycia had said just now, even after a while. Cold, cruel, treacherous, deceitful? Insane and obsessed over influence and power? Just who was his mother? Thales found that the mysteries surrounding his background were becoming greater, especially when it concerned all the abnormalities of his person. The boy gritted his teeth. Jinns watched Thales and shook her head lightly. Do not take it to heart. Jinns pursed her lips, completely unbothered. It is normal that Lycia does not like you, that woman has always been stubborn, and she cannot let things go. Thales lifted his head in curiosity, only to hear the female official flatly say, before she became the ritual master, she was engaged to your father. Thales was shocked when he heard it. Engaged? Yes, because of various reasons, they did not manage to get married. Jinns scoffed disdainfully. Lycia, that woman, she can't survive without a man. Enraged, she ran to Sunset Temple and from then on, decided to serve the goddess her whole life. So she doesn't like me, either, the king's lover. The boy, who just heard a huge piece of gossip, opened his mouth in shock. But why does that matter? At that moment, Jinns recovered her experienced and capable appearance. The first great female official curled the corner of her lips up slightly. Why should you let others' opinions dictate your fate? Even if it is the god's opinion. At this moment, Jinns stopped in front of another, bigger stone chamber, and gently pushed the door open. We are here. Similarly, you have to go in alone. Looking at the stone chamber, Jinns' experienced and confident expression from before disappeared. She heaved a sigh in desolation. Only you and your family can enter this place, the female official said faintly. Us? Thales was bewildered. He finally noticed that there was something off about Jinns who stood before the door. But again, Jinns pushed him into the stone chamber without any explanation. Eternal Star City. Western City Gate. Wait. Are those in front the Karabayan family's carriage fleet? May I know if Count Karabayan himself is there? Uncle? Uncle, is that you? A troop of knights who held a single-winged crow flag rushed over from the city gate and caught up with a carriage that was escorted by more than 10 knights. There was an emblem of 2 towers and a sword carved on the carriage door. The knights with the single-winged crow flags were led by a male noble who seemed to be over 30 years old. He sped up his horse and went in front of the carriage. He then looked at the stern and dignified old noble with graying temples who disembarked from it. Derek, it's you? The Chroma family's young and successful Count of Wingfort rode a horse here, the old noble asked gently. The young Count of Wingfort, Derek Chroma, smiled. It takes at least 2 days and 2 nights to travel here by carriage, and I wouldn't have made it in time, so I decided to just ride here. On my way here, I bumped into the carriage fleet of the Bosdorf and the Lasha families. They should be here soon. Then, among the 13 distinguished families, all the ones from the west should be here. What about you, uncle? I have not seen you for such a long time. How have my cousin brother Cohen, Aunt, Casa, and Gina been? After returning from the battlefield, Cohen could not sit still. I arranged for him to be a police officer in the capital city, hey. Recalling the complaint made by his old friend, Count Karabayan heaved a deep sigh. As for your aunt, she is still the same, always worrying about Cohen's marriage. This has made the 2 little demons at home very happy. They are always urging their mother to organize balls, in the name of finding their brother a wife, the old noble said plainly. What? The young Chroma was stunned for a moment. He then smiled. She has always been like that. When I first reached adulthood, she brought almost half the girls in Walla Hill over. Chroma then took a step forward and said in a low voice, "Then, is that matter true, that King Nuben's only son died in Constellation?" The Count of Wallahil, Tarami Karabayan, looked at his nephew and sighed softly. "It seems to be true. I just bumped into Count Samunto of the Arundi family. I heard that Extet's messenger is already on the way, and that their army force is being assembled now. Right now, the most anxious one should be the Duke of Northern Territory himself and the families under him." Chroma sighed. He leaned his body forward and said with a solemn expression, "Will there be war?" Count Karabayan glanced at his nephew and spoke slowly. "If no miracle happens, you should ask this instead, how bad would the war be? Start stocking up food supplies, and prepare for the enlistment of soldiers within the territory." As he spoke, he got down from the carriage and opened his arms to embrace Western City's director of the police station, Lord Lorbek Dara, who was welcoming him. "It's been a long time, old friend. Ha, you have gotten so much plumper. This is the Count of Wingfort, and also my nephew, Derek Chroma. He is one of the 19 vassals who are qualified to receive His Majesty's General Edict. You are the one-winged savior from within the 13 distinguished families, the legendary Chroma. You must be the horse slayer, Lord Lorbek Dara, who rose to fame during the fortress battle 12 years ago? Ha, that damned battle." After Karabayan introduced Lorbek and Chroma to each other, a melodious chime suddenly rang from a distance away. Dawn. The chime was heavy and long, and could be heard from far away. Chroma, who did not visit the capital city often, frowned. "If I am not mistaken, is that not the bell of Constellation? Did something significant happen?" Lorbek, who had been in the capital city for many years, nodded. "Yes. When the bell of Constellation rings, it means that something important would be announced at the center of all main districts. Usually, it would be the wedding of someone from the royal family or some important personage, however, lately there has been no." At that moment. Dawn. The long chime rang again. Lorbek's expression changed, and he said solemnly, "The bell rang for a second time. This signifies that within a few hours, His Majesty would be convening a national conference at Renaissance Palace's Hall of Stars." A national conference? The conference that is known to be directed towards all citizens, whether they are nobles or the populace? Chroma's face had paled. But the news of the assassination of the Extet diplomat group is still a secret, and only circulated among the nobles. Even the higher parliamentary meeting of Constellation would only be held tonight, is it not? Why would a national conference be convened right now? True. The matters discussed in the national conference will be announced to the entire Star Plaza, and the entire Constellation. Do you still remember the declaration of the Desert War? Director Lorbek thought hard. Count Derek Chroma watched the citizens of the capital city who gossiped in excitement and rushed towards Star Plaza. His expression was unpleasant. Could it be that His Majesty is making the news public and declaring war on Extet in advance? Who knows? Count Karabayan's expression turned gloomy. He is the Iron Hand King, and it is not as if he has never done anything like this before. Chapter 56, Live for Constellation. This stone chamber was extremely huge, so huge that it could still appear spacious even if there were over 20 large stone pillars in it. However, there was no window. Instead, there were only a few large black holes on the ceiling served as air vents. It was terrifyingly gloomy and cold. Thales stared dazedly at the scene in front of him. A robust figure wearing an astral blue cape stood with his back to Thales before a stone pillar. A grotto had been dug on the stone pillar where the robust figure was facing. Inside, 2 large stone urns were placed side by side, along with 6 little stone jars. A deep and authoritative voice rang from the figure. "Here lies your grandfather, 80 Jade Star. Honestly, I did not like to be in the same room as him. When he looked at me, his gaze was always filled with disappointment and accusation. After my mother passed away, I avoided him even more fervently." That voice did not sound too unfamiliar to Thales. However, he was not very acquainted with it either. "Come here." Thales inhaled deeply and adjusted his emotions. He walked towards his so-called father, the Supreme King of Constellation, King Kessel Jade Star. The Iron Hand King, Kessel V, was wearing the crown with the 9-pointed star. He had an everlasting lamp in his right hand, and tightly held a crystal-studded scepter with a shining tip in his left hand. He turned and glanced at Thales. His sharp gaze made the boy a little breathless. "Starting from our second king, John I, all supreme kings and queens of Constellation were buried in this stone chamber after their death and cremation." Kessel's voice sounded extremely low and deep, as if he was afraid that he would rouse something. Kessel extended his hand and placed it on the large stone urn on the left. A name was engraved on it. King of Eternal Rule, King, 80 LK Jade Star, 595 to 660. Kessel looked at the other large stone urn on the right. There was another name on it. This was my mother. She passed away when I was 15. Queen, Natalie J. F. Jade Star, 604 to 642. The Supreme King ran his hand over the small stone jars with a complicated, indecipherable expression. As for the king's sons and daughters who did not inherit the crown nor change their surname, they rest within these little stone jars. Thales was stunned. He slowly turned his head and, as expected, saw that all 4 sides of each stone pillar had 2 large stone urns inside. There would sometimes be a few little stone jars beside them. Is this the royal family's burial ground? Kessel lowered his head and looked towards a small stone jar. Thales followed his gaze. Starlight God of War, Liberator of Zodra, Duke of Star Lake, John L. K. Jade Star, 613 to 660. This is Uncle John, the only person in our family who had traveled around the world. He is my father's youngest brother and was almost completely raised by my mother. This is why I insisted to place him in my father's grotto. Kessel ran his hand over the stone jar and flashed a smile, much to Thales' surprise. He was experienced and knowledgeable and had great fighting skills. He was also funny, and no one's jokes could surpass his. When I was young, every time he came back, my twin brothers and I loved to follow him around and listen to his stories about his romance with Maine Enox's princess, until my mother coldly exposed him. At that time, I had thought that he was the greatest person in the world. John's marriage made my father extremely furious. My God, he married a supreme-class female knight. That part of their wedding where they hugged and kissed, I think John must have done it with both feet off the ground. After being anointed a duke, John often visited us in the capital city. From time to time, he brought young Constance little gifts. However, after his wife passed away, I rarely saw John smile after that. Feeling the atmosphere in the stone chamber, Thales did not even dare to exhale. Kessel was lost in his memories, and only turned after a minute. Kessel looked at another stone jar and frowned slightly. This is my eldest brother, my dear. He was supposed to inherit the crown. Hearing a familiar name, Thales immediately looked towards the stone jar. Eldest son of the king, crown prince, my dear Te Jadestar, 622 to 660. He had the closest relationship with our father, and was the only one who could match up to him when playing chess. He was a man of few words, and always smiled as he watched us brothers mess around. He was clever, and also very likable. Everyone said that he was the best crown prince. He was also the brother I was closest to. One day, when I was 16, on the way back from a female servant's room, I accidentally saw him sitting despondently in the courtyard, drinking wine with a distressed expression. At that time, I was only puzzled. He had moments when he felt dejected, too. Now, I finally understand him. Thales looked at the stone jar and thought of the things he had heard about my dear Jadestar. So, this is Jin's rescuer, someone Gilbert respects, and the person Yodel hopes that I will be better than? The next stone jar. The Sword of Reversing Light, the second prince, Horus M.E. Jadestar, 623 to 660. This is Horus. He still holds the record for the highest sword speed in the Tower of Eradication during his student days. The last I heard, it had not been broken yet. Kessel tapped the stone jar with his fingernail and snorted. He is the only supreme class elite in my family, and even had a prestigious nickname. My father always exclaimed about how the Jadestar royal family finally had a third person in the supreme class, after the Oathkeeper, my dear the fourth and the enemy of the wolves, Prince Kira. His relationship with my eldest brother, my dear, was very bad. When playing chess with my dear, he liked to use his power of eradication to catapult off the latter's chess pieces in secret. Even with that, he was never able to defeat the smiling my dear. He always told us that, if he was not born a year later than my dear, he should have been the crown prince. A month before he passed away, he received an invitation from the Tower of Eradication to become a scion. If he passed, he could have become one of the 8 supreme-class scions of the Tower of Eradication. These are Bancroft and Herman, my twin brothers. Kessel glanced towards 2 stone jars, which were placed side by side, with a complicated gaze. It was said that a careless female servant messed up their birth order. My father could not endure the sight of 2 doctors arguing about which baby's head was bigger. That was why my mother simply flipped a gold coin, and with Tormund I's head portrait, decided that Bancroft would be the 3rd prince, and Herman the 4th. That gold coin is now placed in my mother's stone urn together with the first sheet of politics homework my dear got full marks for, Horus's first swordsman trophy, and the baby wrapping cloth used on me and Constance when we were born. Thales took a step forward and surveyed the 2 little stone jars clearly. The 3rd prince, Bancroft N.E. Jadestar, 624 to 660. The 4th prince, Herman N.E. Jadestar, 624 to 660. When we were young, both of them fought endlessly on the dining table. It was virtually our whole family's nightmare. My dear joked that Horus probably went to study in the Tower of Eradication because he was so horrified by those 2. Bancroft especially enjoyed drawing and sculpting. Half of the funding for the Arts and Culture Department of the National Research Institute was donated by him. However, he was also quite vain. The degree of his vanity was probably only second to his love for money. When we were young, we always said that he should unite with the Sukater family through marriage. Even the dowry itself would be enough for his entire life spending. In the end, when he visited the southern islands, he really did manage to marry a girl from the Sukater family by proposing with a sketch. As for Herman, he was the most handsome one out of the 5 brothers. He was also skilled in music and poetry. All the young girls, whether from the populous or noble families, liked him a lot more compared to the other brothers. Every time he walked on the streets, screams and flowers would follow. That was why he was my father's first choice for the leader of Constellation's delegation to Sacred Tree Kingdom. Unfortunately, he did not manage to marry an elf. Otherwise, my father might have passed the crown down to him to strengthen our elf blood that had been present since my dear the 4th. Kessel held his scepter and gazed at the flame inside the everlasting lamp. The 5 of us used to be so close. I still remember that when we were young, we had a group fight in the palace with 3 princes who visited from Maine Enox dynasty. Horus was responsible for attacking and my dear was the one defending. He was mainly protecting me. The twins were flanking. But after we grew up, everything changed. My dear was still full of smiles, and I was the closest to him. But I felt that he was becoming more and more unhappy. After returning from the Tower of Eradication, Horus became murderous, and was always trying to show off in front of our father. I still remember that during an imperial conference, he reprimanded me for 5 minutes for going to Red Street Market. Bancroft did not care much for matters between us siblings. However, he always walked the other way when he saw the four of us. Herman was always following Horus around like a lackey. That smile of his really disgusted me. However, Kessel suddenly stopped smiling, but all that is not important anymore. Now, they are reunited here. Kessel walked towards the last little jar. Thales lowered his head and softly clenched his fist. Eldest daughter of the king, Constance N.E. Jadestar, 642 to 660. This is Constance, our little sister. Kessel lowered his head and spoke with a heavy voice. He seemed like he did not want to say much. She is the only consensus between the 5 of us. We would have sacrificed everything to protect her happiness and smiles. Thales sighed. He shut his eyes softly and imagined his aunt, the princess who died when she was 18. The Jadestar family was born to carry the fate of Constellation, Kessel said plainly. Thales opened his eyes. Listening to Kessel's heavy breaths, he contemplated the king's reasons for doing what he did today. In the empty stone chamber, both of them did not speak for quite some time. Boom! The king suddenly knocked his scepter hard on the ground. Thales was so surprised he almost jumped. I do not know how much you understand about us, nor do I know what you are imagining in regards to the Jadestar surname. Kessel V's voice was low and stern, not a hint of fatherly emotion was present. But this is definitely not a relaxing title. It signifies glory, history, and power. More importantly, it signifies sacrifice. Thales was at a loss for words. He did not know how to reply. Nothing seemed like a correct response. Are you prepared? Kessel finally turned around. His sharp and oppressing sky-blue irises stared straight at Thales. After being conferred the Jadestar surname, to battle for Constellation, die for Constellation, and... Kessel stared at the 6 little stone jars. His gaze dimmed. Live for Constellation. Thales' breathing halted for a moment and then became intensely heavy. To battle for Constellation. To die for Constellation. To live for Constellation? This order. Thales thought fearfully, so, as a Jadestar, to live is far more difficult than to battle and to die? The king's gaze was fixed on him. I am waiting for your answer, the king enunciated each word slowly. No room for doubt, and no possibility of defiance. Thales gulped. He could not really stand the atmosphere right now. The boy forced a smile and spoke, to scream about dying for a country or anything like that, it really sounds like I'm about to fight in a war. However, Kessel still watched him with a burning gaze. All right, then. Thales took 3 deep breaths and opened his eyes. He spoke with a downcast tone. No. Kessel's brow furrowed slightly. The boy said with disappointment, before leaving Red Street Market, all I did was for the sake of struggling to survive. To survive in this damned world. I never thought about anything like what is happening right now, the royal family, conspiracies, being an heir, everything. He spoke sincerely, I am not ready to play these games at all, these games where everyone is able to talk and laugh as if nothing is happening even though lives could be lost any time. I am more used to worn down houses and hard beds. More used to curling up in a corner, cold and hungry. More used to striving for my friend's survival, as well as my own survival. I am not used to eating and drinking in a luxurious room while plotting conspiracies, taking away lives, and starting or dealing with wars, all with a straight face. The boy exhaled and lowered his head. I am also not prepared to become Thales Jadestar. Everything happened due to a coincidence, I am not prepared at all. It was as though Asta's figure appeared in front of his eyes again and was smiling while speaking to him, yes, this is indeed a coincidence. There was a long silence. Kessel stared at Thales. However, the king who was usually authoritative and unapproachable suddenly put on a complicated and profound expression that the latter had never seen before. To strive for the survival of one and one's friends. This is probably the entirety of Jadestar's destiny. It is fine. There seemed to be emotions running through the king's eyes. He spoke slowly, that year, I was not prepared either. Thales raised his head in surprise. With mockery and hatred, Kessel V spoke firmly, enunciating each word, and fate will prepare everything for you. He swung his cape and took large strides. Thales followed Kessel as he went to the side of the stone pillar. There was also a grotto there, but it was empty without any large stone urns. There were only 2 little stone jars in it. This shall be my burial ground, even though there are already 2 jars here, Kessel said plainly as he bent down and caressed the 2 stone jars without any facial expression. Thales' mind stopped working for a fraction of a second. He thought of Gilbert's words about the bloody year, and gazed at the jars. The eldest daughter of the king, Lydia G.E.K. Jadestar, 656 to 660. I still remember when Lydia was first born, I carried her in my bosom, and was more at a loss than she was. After growing a little, she began running everywhere and was never quiet. Eldest son of the king, Luther K.K. Jadestar, 659 to 660. Kessel put the everlasting lamp down, hiding his gaze and expression in the shadows. Only his moving lips could be seen, and the corners were slightly curled up. Luther, on the other hand, was very well behaved and quiet. He never cried. This was horrible, because we never knew when he was hungry. These 2 children made Kia and Jin's worry a lot. As for myself, I was always happy because I was required to do nothing. The Supreme King of Constellation put his hands on Thales' shoulders. The boy was stunned. Fortunately, they do not have to worry about the children anymore. Kessel's words were bone-chilling. Thales listened with his hair standing on end as Kessel finished speaking. Because they will always be here. Not crying and screaming, not running around, always. The king suddenly exerted force and grabbed Thales' shoulder hard. Thales' left shoulder was still in pain from the injury. However, he endured it and did not say anything. Look, this is what fate prepared for me. Looking at the two little stone jars, Thales clenched his teeth and his fists lightly. Are these, my older sister and brother? At that moment, a long and heavy chime rang from outside the stone chamber that buried all of Constellation's kings. Go. Kessel Jadestar let go of Thales. Gilbert and Jins are waiting for you outside the door. The king stood up and regained his authoritative and oppressing demeanor. He spoke with an ice-cold countenance. They will prepare everything for you. Just like how fate has also prepared everything for you. Chapter 57, Prelude. As Thales walked out of the stone chamber with complicated and indecipherable emotions, he already made his guess regarding the long chime and what would be happening next. Is it happening today? He looked calmly at Gilbert and Jins, who had been waiting for quite some time. It's so sudden. Gilbert's gaze was filled with sighs and sadness. On the other hand, Jin's cold expression had a hint of hesitance in it. Shouldn't they be cheering and jumping in joy instead? Why do they look like this? Thales thought, devoid of energy. His mind was filled with what just happened in the stone chamber and what would be happening next. For some reason, although his heart was heavy at the moment, he could conceal it in his expression. Is this the so-called poker face? Gilbert spoke bitterly, please accept my apologies. This was not what I intended. Extet's emergency envoy will be arriving in Constellation tonight. Regardless of whether they are declaring war or making a compromise, at that time His Majesty will. Gilbert furrowed his brows extremely tightly. He wanted to say something, but sighed deeply and stopped himself. Do not waste any more time. The national conference would be held at 3 in the afternoon. His Majesty ordered us to bring him into the waiting room before 1. Jins cut Gilbert off. Her gaze was obscure and indecipherable. The former Foreign Affairs Minister and the first great female official had changed into dark-colored, somber formal clothing. The 8 female servants behind them held, with flat expressions, 8 full salvers as they stood quietly and neatly on both sides of the corridor. Dawn. The bell chimed for the second time. Jins walked forward with a complicated expression and led the heavy-hearted Thales into another room. The 8 female servants followed them in. Renaissance Palace, Outer Palace Wall, the first portcullis. This was where Thales passed by yesterday. The place was barely in order due to the guards' rude yells and merciless berating. Nobles of various ranks and important figures of various occupations formed a long queue there. With varying facial expressions, they all fought for a place to enter Renaissance Palace. In front of Renaissance Palace, at the position of the first heavy and modeled portcullis, tense guards conducted strict checks and allowed only those who were qualified to attend the conference. Me. I am the deputy chairman of the Iron Smelting Guild, and have the right to enter and observe. What? There are 25 deputy chairmen in the Iron Smelting Guild? Hey, you wouldn't know this, but they're just there to make up the numbers. I'm the only one who is more special. Let me tell you, look at my black hair and black eyes. Do you understand? Did you know that our family's craftsmanship originated from the Dawn Dynasty in the Far East? It was before the Battle of Eradication. Fine. A man of honor talks things through and does not resort to force. I won't go in, is this not enough? I am Eros Kata, a fabric merchant who was granted special permission by the royal family. I can go in. See? This is a signed certificate from the late King 80, and there is even Prince Mighty's signature below it. I also have the invitation Mindes III sent to our family years ago here. Although it is a little old, it is still only 150 years ago. Hey, don't be violent. I'll leave on my own accord. Hey! Punk! Do you still remember me? I am Lazen, a forensic officer at the Central Police Station. We were colleagues for half a year. Are there any seats left in the Hall of Stars? I am on duty here, I don't know. However, my cousin brother who was a castle guard told me that the big hall is almost half filled. If you are not a noble who is above the rank of Viscount, you won't be able to get in at all. Then, is joining the crowds at Star Plaza our only choice? To listen as those guards pass the decisions of the more influential people down, tier by tier? Let it be. For people of our status, even if we managed to get into the Hall of Stars, we would be sitting at the bottommost and outermost tier, quietly listening to the important people at the uppermost and innermost tier talk. It would be impossible for us to chip in. My god, those are the heraldry for the single-winged crow and the sword of the Twin Towers. It's the Chroma and Karabayan family's carriage fleet. Make way, quickly. It wouldn't end well for you if you offend them. So what if they are nobles? Nobles also have to obey basic rules. Wait, no, they have to obey the Constellation Provisional Constitution. What sort of joke is that? They are not normal nobles. Those people are high-ranking vassals who were conferred their titles by the royal families. They have more than 1,000 private soldiers, possess vast territories, and have countless subjects. As a forensic officer, you should increase your knowledge. Do you know about the 13 distinguished families? These people, the royal family, and the 6 great clans can laugh and joke together. Why do you know this so well? My apologies. I used to work in Kisen family's manor in the Eastern City District and taught their family's 3 sons the basic skills for combat. Ignoring the jostling of the crowds around him, Count Derek Chroma's cavalier unit and Count Tarami Karabayan's carriage passed through the crowds, managing to reach Renaissance Palace only half an hour after the bell chimed for the second time. The 2 counts, Derek Chroma and Old Karabayan, were commonly known as the 2 highly ranked nobles among the 13 distinguished families and the 13 high-ranking vassals, only second to the royal family and the 6 great clans. With the single-winged crow flag and the sword of the Twin Towers emblem and heraldry, they effortlessly passed through the crowd. They then went past the first outer palace wall and the palace door amid the crowd's low murmurs, accompanied by the guards and the palace officers' respectful gazes. Director Lorbeck, who was in the carriage, sighed lightly. There has never been so many people at the National Conference before. In the Desert Wars National Conference, only the leaders of various trades, wealthy businessmen, and those rancid, prestigious scholars attended. Among the 6 great clans, only 2 clans attended, and among the 13 distinguished families, only 5 families were there. However, for His Majesty to win over the battle support he needs, the 19 noble families have no choice but to obey the resolution of the National Conference. Karabayan looked outside the carriage window solemnly. The crowd became bigger and bigger. The few noble families who refused to obey the resolution were, at some point, besieged by furious citizens, and even encountered difficulties in various fields. Although they are only vassals of the large families, this is not a good sign. The young Count of Wingfort, Derek Chroma, rode his horse near to the carriage window. His expression was unpleasant. My lords, we should hurry up. Even though the 19 noble families have specific seats in the conference and will not be forced to listen to the conference at Star Plaza under the palace balcony, soon, we might need to fight our way through the populace and those upstart nobles. On the other hand, the Star Plaza, located right below the Hall of Stars to the northwest of Renaissance Palace, was filled with noise and commotion. A pioneering effort by the virtuous king, the National Conference was said to be directed to all citizens. It was the only time when the populace and minor nobles can listen to Constellation's highest powers play their games, and it will be held this evening. Every single topic, discussion and decision would be passed through the entire Star Plaza by specially assigned people, and all the citizens in the entire capital will be notified. Gennard frowned and looked at the bustling crowd in the entire plaza. He and his city defense squad were temporarily transferred over from the Eastern City District in the morning to maintain the order of Star Plaza together with the police force. God have mercy. How would that be possible? It would be impossible for them, with only a force of approximately 1,000 men, to maintain the order of Star Plaza, which can accommodate tens of thousands of people. It would even be impossible for Duke John's Starlight Brigade from years ago to maintain any sort of order. Everybody's gaze was concentrated on the location of the conference above them, the hall with its outdoor area facing the Star Plaza, the Hall of Stars. Under the bellows of thousands of guards in the plaza and the gigantic city defense ballistae, which have been positioned on Renaissance Palace's walls where they would be on standby to attack, the crowds nonchalantly jostled and exchanged information about the king's sudden decision to hold a national conference. I guess that it will be about the huge explosion in Red Street Market a month ago. Is it because the Blood Bottle Gang was so badly defeated by the Blackstreet Brotherhood that they became extremely anxious and went insane? Can such a small gang battle alarm the nobility up there? Where did you get this gossip? And a well-presented one at that. What's a Blood Bottle Gang and Blackstreet Brotherhood? How can there be gangs in the capital city? We are living in a modern society. Our lives now are so pleasant. Why are you spreading these damaging theories? Looking at your sneaky face, you must be a spy from a foreign power, right? Believe me, because I'm definitely right. It must be the Baron Bone people rebelling again. Those tradesmen from Camus Union who are greedier than vampires are definitely behind it. Last month, they detained my family's trade caravan. They wanted to impose on us 50% tax. Can you believe that? 50 out of 100%. Those damned Baron Bone mongrels. Why is the legendary Wing so soft-hearted? He should learn a thing or two from His Majesty, catch all of them and bury them alive at the Aloof God's altar like orcs. You are not allowed to insult the legendary Wing. He's extremely handsome. Indeed, he is an existence that could unite the entire Western Peninsula with his looks alone. My aunt is a female servant in the house of a viscount in the Morningstar region. She told me that Ekstead had an accident, I think it was at the north. Oh yeah, why is their diplomat group not here yet? How is that possible? The Fortress Treaty was signed to take effect for 20 years. Besides that, we have the Fortress Flower that guards the Broken Dragon Fortress well. There are also powerful families in the Northern Territory such as the Arundi family, the Zamunto family and the Fries family. It can't possibly be like 12 years ago. Don't forget that the kingdom's wrath is still in the capital city. With just him alone, along with that bow of his, he can eradicate 20,000 people from Ekstedt. Ekstedt probably doesn't even have 20,000 soldiers throughout its entire country. In short, that was what I meant. I think it's most probably Northwest Serra Dukedom. A relative that came to seek refuge with me from far away said that lately, there is an evil witch spreading a plague there. Their neighbors, Anlenzo Dukedom and Norton Dukedom, have shut their borders. Wait, the plague hasn't spread to Constellation yet, right? The nobles from the southwest did not come, right? How about the T-Bark family, Karabayan, and Lasha? Don't tell me that they are dead from the plague? So, does this mean that the price of herbs would rise? I have to restock immediately. You guys are talking rubbish. My secret source told me that His Majesty will be choosing a person out of the 6 great clans to become the next king. What? Then how about the Jade Star royal family? Our family has the royal family's special permission for furniture trading rights. What else can be done? Can you force His Majesty to give birth to one more son? I think the Duke Covendir is not bad. Last year, when he came to inspect the Grand Bazaar, he held my hand before. With a count like that, how can our country not prosper? But I think that T-Bark family's daughter isn't bad, either. We should learn from Anlenzo Dukedom. Think about it, a beautiful and young queen. Oh God, my heart is about to melt. Stop joking. That's for rural places like Anlenzo and Alumbia. Our mighty constellation is the successor of the empire. How can we let a woman become king? I am not discriminating women, but we have to admit to objective differences. Young man, stop making wild guesses over there. I am just concerned with politics. I think that you are a keyboard I'm sorry, a mouth cannon warrior. You should believe in the kingdom, believe in His Majesty and believe in the Imperial Conference. How can they not know something that even you know? Thales slowly stood and looked at the young noble in the mirror who wore luxurious clothing and a cold expression. His hair was no longer messy, but neatly cut and combed into a hairstyle that was simple yet pleasant, making him look alert and handsome. Jins even clipped on a subtly sparkling crystal stone earring on his left ear without regards for his facial expression. He had on a long-sleeved jacket that was made thicker and decorated with dark blue glittering crystals. Coupled with a white undershirt, cuffs that were nicely buttoned up with crystal drops, and a specially tailored macrame mantle. His attire made his originally frail body look straight and tall. He raised his hands. His pure white, leather gloves were well-fitted and shiny. It seemed to give more depth to his every move. The noble, black slacks, paired with a belt buckle styled in the fashion of stars, along with the expensive leather boots that boosted his height by 2 inches, allowed him to walk with the gracefulness of nobles. A 9-pointed star emblem which signified the Jade Star family was sewn on the back of Thales' clothes, and a gold and silver 9-pointed star brooch was clipped on his chest. They sparkled under the light. The female servants sprayed a bit of cologne on him. It was almost undetectable, but made his scent closer to that of the upper-class society. Thales chuckled bitterly and sighed, hey. Fashionable clothing, graceful manners, established etiquette and limited knowledge. These are the best tools to segregate and divide people into different social statuses. This is the circle of nobles. This damned, evil, culture. Even Jins and Gilbert, who were observing from the side, could not help but nod. Jin sighed, her tone was bitter. It is almost time. Kessel, His Majesty hopes that you would go in earlier. Thales knew that their emotions were not quite right. However, since he was already there, he cleared all thoughts from his mind and slowly left with Gilbert and Jins. I need to get a final confirmation from you on some things. Thales raised his head and looked at Gilbert. Your name, I mean, His Majesty originally planned to give you a name that is more suitable for the Jade Star tradition, such as John and My Dear, or Kessel and Tormund. After all, the name Thales is one used by the populace. It will be appearing in the royal pedigree for the first time, and will allow those who are observant to find out about your past. Thales turned his head back and while walking forward, spoke without changing his expression, Thales. What? I want to be called Thales. I will not change my name. Those past experiences, I will not forget, nor forsake any of them. Staring at the endlessly long corridor, Thales clenched his fists tightly and paid no heed to Gilbert's hesitant gaze. Hey, I shall follow your will. Under Jin's murderous gaze, Gilbert sighed. It was a very long corridor. Thales did not bat an eyelash. He took a few dozen steps forward and stopped. There was a large black door in front of him. This is the Hall of Stars. You would be going into the dark, innermost room. You do not have to be nervous. When it is time, I will open the door, and you just have to do as you were told beforehand. Gilbert lowered his head as he spoke, but he immediately looked at one side of the door. The middle-aged noble put on a puzzled expression. I da? At this time, you should be beside His Majesty and protecting him. Thales looked ahead, a petite figure was leaning against one side of the door. It's her. Thales could recognize her as the cloaked woman from yesterday who led the royal guards and saved him from Zayn. Her face was still covered by the cloak and could not be seen under the dim lighting. The cloaked woman had her arms crossed as she got up from the wall she was leaning on. Hey, kid, that masked guy asked me to give you this gift on his behalf. A young, pleasant, and lively voice rang as the cloaked woman passed him something. Thales was stunned. He took it and did not even pay attention to the cloaked woman's overly fair, smooth, and supple skin. It was a black dagger sheath, and it came with a buckled leather strap. Words were engraved on one side, a king does not gain respect by virtue of his bloodline. Thales resisted the urge to subconsciously touch his chest. With complicated emotions, he pulled out JC's dagger from his belt and inserted it into the sheath, the size was just right. Thank you, Yodel, is he well? Thales calmed down his breath and buckled the sheathed dagger onto his belt. Don't worry. That sort of person won't die for now. The cloaked woman chuckled lightly. I understand him very well. Thales nodded and walked past her, standing still in front of the door. Looking at the black stone door in front of him, the boy clenched his teeth. Only one more step. Behind him, Gilbert's frown became deeper and deeper while Jin's bit hard on her bottom lip. On the other hand, the cloaked woman exercised her neck nonchalantly. Thales did not turn. He just gazed at the stone-gray floor before him and faintly said, "Gilbert, will I never be able to turn back after taking this step?" Gilbert was stunned, but Thales did not plan to let him answer. The boy raised his head and forced a smile with difficulty. "No, perhaps, when I first opened my eyes in this world, there was already no turning back. I can only keep walking forward." Having heard this, Jin's gaze became hesitant and hard to understand. She extended her hand, but was pulled back by Gilbert, who shook his head beside her. "Do not worry, be a little happier. This is a good thing, Sir Gilbert, Madame Jins, and this cloaked lady. A good person once told me to." Illuminated by the everlasting lamps with sunlight that shone in from the windows on both sides of the corridor, Thales turned around. He stuck out his thumb and cracked a bright smile. "Just take it as another game." Before the other three could react, Thales pushed the door open and walked inside. A gust of cold air rushed past the large stone door. The lighting ahead was dim, and it seemed as if there was endless darkness. Thales' figure disappeared amid that darkness. Gilbert lowered his head as he sighed. Jins turned her head and did not say anything. Only the woman in the cloak happily snapped her fingers. "Aha, I like this kid." Jins raised her head and chuckled bitterly and helplessly, her face was filled with sadness and sympathy. "True, this kid, he is only a child. How can he shoulder such a heavy burden and future?" There was a period of silence, until a raspy voice suddenly spoke up, "He can." The woman in the cloak stuck out her chin. "Such fast recovery." Gilbert and Jins looked behind them in surprise. There, the masked protector's silhouette appeared out of thin air. However, weirdly, Yodel's figure was floating about and extremely blurry, as if covered by a veil made of air. The bleary-figured Yodel spoke firmly, "He can shoulder those sorts of responsibilities. I understand him well. He has special qualities that no one else in this world has, not humans, not gods, not demons. Not even mystics." There was another period of silence. Gilbert shook his head and snorted lightly. He then tipped his hat in salutation. "I am sorry for excusing myself. The national conference is only 2 hours away. Madame Jins, we should be seeing His Majesty." Jins nodded and left together with Gilbert. The two figures disappeared at the corridor some distance away as their footsteps faded away. There were only the masked protector and the cloaked woman left. "Your chest was pierced by 3 crossbow arrows laced with highly poisonous vine bluegrass. It has only been a night, and it's impossible that you are able to stand up." The cloaked woman looked at the bleary-figured Yodel and sighed loudly. "Did you make a deal with that mask again? I have warned you many times. The collapse of the ancient elf kingdom is not unrelated to that mask. And you, what price did you pay this time?" Yodel did not answer, he only stayed silent and caressed the purple mask on his face. "No matter what price I paid," Yodel's figure slowly disappeared, and only his raspy voice remained. "It cannot compare to 1/10,000th of the price the child will have to pay." Chapter 58, The Warlord's Chess Game, 1. Thales was not concerned with anything else. He walked into the dark room in rapt concentration. The buzzing sound commonly heard from crowds rang from outside the dark room. It was noisy and disturbing. This reminded him of the football team he used to support in his past life. This is probably similar to the feeling one got when they first walk into the stadium during a live match. Amid the buzzing sounds outside the dark room, a young and jovial male voice suddenly said, "Hey, old man. Director Lorbeck. I am here. Hey, sir, you look a little familiar. Wait, you are Chroma family's cousin Derek. Oh God, I have not seen you for so many years. What happened to your face? Casa and Gina must be crying." Thales suddenly regained his attention and took a few steps forward. He looked outside through the one-way glass in the dark room. Indeed, the entire Hall of Stars was below him. The Hall of Stars was an oval-shaped, semi-open-air hall. It was at least more than 10 meters tall and could accommodate at least 1,000 people. The side-facing Star Plaza had a protruding balcony instead of a wall. This made the hall look like an irregularly shaped cylinder with one lateral side chopped off at a slanted angle, or rather, like a half-covered cylindrical garbage shovel. Having thought of this, Thales could not help but flash a smile. At that moment, the hall was already half full. There were at least a few hundred people in it. Some people were sitting, and some were standing. The nearer it was to the center of the hall, the sparser the crowd. Their clothes seemed luxurious, they were quiet and composed, and most of them had seats. These were the nobles. There was a large round table in the middle of the hall that was surrounded by 7 stone chairs of obviously different specifications. Among the unique stone chairs was the throne. The 6 stone chairs surrounding it belonged to the 6 guardian dukes. There were 13 other stone chairs on the periphery of the 6 stone chairs. They formed a large semicircle and belonged to the 13 distinguished families. The 6 stone chairs were still empty, but some of the 13 stone chairs were already occupied. The occupants were all men ranging from 20 to 60 years old, and bore different emblems and symbols. Their expressions varied too. There were a few nervous-looking attendants behind every seat. The voice he heard just now originated from the stone chairs belonging to the 13 distinguished families. A blond, handsome man wearing an astral blue police uniform stood behind one of the stone chairs. He had a nice-looking face with deep-set features. Compared to the fairly feminine Asda and the pretty face Astrone, he appeared more energetic and strong. However, the handsome man was being hit hard on the head with a staff by a gray-haired middle-aged noble who looked extremely angry. The middle-aged noble's clothing had a symbol of two tall towers and a long sword on it. Cohen Karabayan, what happened to your noble upbringing? Do you know how to talk like a human? Derek is not only your cousin brother, but also the head of the Chroma family, one of the 13 distinguished families. He is the suzerain of Wingfort and a count of the kingdom. Show some respect. With a face filled with shock, Thales stared at the kingdom's police officer, Cohen Karabayan, as he massaged his head with clenched teeth and growled at his father, "Old man, the stage of eradication is in front of us anyway. Hit me one more time, and we will battle up there." A lot of people turned their head towards their direction, but seeing that it was the seat of one of the 13 distinguished families, they all shook their heads and ignored the commotion. Why is this noble family so weird? Cohen and I know each other really well. This shows how close we are. Derek seemed to know his uncle and cousin brother's daily routine. He immediately waved his hand to signal that there was nothing to fear. On the other hand, Lorbeck frantically pulled the old Count Karabayan, preventing him from furiously waving the staff for a second time. By the way, Cohen, even though you are the eldest son of the Karabayan family, how did you manage to be let in before your father arrived? The director of the Western City Police Station, Lorbeck Dara, immediately changed the topic. I am not very sure either. Cohen scratched his head and frowned. I only recovered from the injury I sustained in Red Street Market a few days ago. Old man, put down your staff, we'll talk about this at home, and received an order to be on duty. As soon as I reached the door of Renaissance Palace, seeing that I'm one of them, the people from the city defense team and the police station let me in. Hearing that I'm a Karabayan, the guards in the palace immediately led me into the Hall of Stars. Having heard this, his father, Count Karabayan, the suzerain of Walla, was stunned. The old count did not inquire further. Both he and Derek Chroma sat on their respective stone chairs. A few attending knights, Cohen and Lorbeck, stood behind him. Listening to their conversation, Thales made a rough guess that those two families were part of the 13 distinguished families. At that moment, the noisy crowd suddenly became silent. Thales' gaze turned towards the other direction. A distance away, two memorable figures stepped into the Hall of Stars. They were flanked by two teams of attendants as they stepped on the blue star-streaked carpet. The people in front of them automatically moved aside. Some of them bowed in greeting, and others were whispering. Among the two figures, a plump and rich-looking old man smiled good-naturedly, occasionally responding to those around him. Embroidered on his back was a sword and a shield that were crossed against the background of a red sun. That was the kingdom's prime minister, the suzerain of splendid Port City and the guardian duke of the Eastern Sea, Bob Cullen. Beside him, another fierce-looking middle-aged noble in uniform took huge strides forward. His expression was cold and he did not look around at all. The middle-aged noble wore a chain armor as his upper garment. It could be clearly seen that on his chest, there was a sharp-eyed falcon, spreading its wings against a white background. He was the suzerain of Cold Castle and the guardian duke of the Northern Territory, Val Arundi. The sun sword and shield, and the white-backed flying falcon. Their symbols represented the two most powerful families among the 6 great clans. National Conference? This is practically a mockery. The Duke of the Northern Territory, Val, had a scar on his chin. His expression was of discontent and he did not bother controlling his volume. He spoke furiously to the plump old man beside him. He personally signed and issued a general edict. And then he suddenly involved the populace in this. This is practically a betrayal. As the Prime Minister, you should stop him. Around them, all the nobles of minor nobility and intermediate nobility classes who heard the contents of their conversation immediately lowered their heads or turned and left. Well, excuse them. Who would dare to listen as members of the 6 great guardian dukes accused the supreme king of Constellation? The white-haired, jolly and plump guardian duke of the Eastern Sea puffed his ruddy cheeks. Wearing an expensive mink skin shawl, he tapped his large, swelled-up belly. He spoke helplessly, although I do not find it appropriate either, I am unable to stop it as it is His Majesty's will. Val snorted in discontent. He was not satisfied with the Prime Minister's excuse. A fat old man who sits on the fence and has no standing of his own. How did he become known as the Sword of the Gulf when he was young? As they walked past the 13 stone chairs, all the seated nobles stood up and bowed respectfully, including the old Karabayan and young Chroma. Even though he is the king we have sworn fealty to, he should not insult us like this. Val nimbly took off his cape and gave it to an attendant behind him who was obviously a warrior. He then brazenly sat down on his seat. Val Arundi had experienced many things in life. On the chain armor he wore was the flying falcon on white. It was embroidered on the chest, and it appeared extremely cold. He propped up his left hand in an extravagant manner, and his being exuded the type of sharpness and isolated aura only found in Northlanders. He did not hide his disdain towards the king at all. I really feel like knocking out that bastard's front teeth. Just like I did 40 years ago. Behind his father's seat, Cohen spoke in a low voice. Even if he is the Duke of the Northern Territory, how can he speak about His Majesty like this without hiding it at all? If you grew up with His Majesty since you were young, and almost married your sister to him, Count Karabayan answered in a whisper, you can talk about His Majesty like this too. The old Duke Cullen sighed lightly as he shakily sat down on one of the 6 stone chairs with the help of his attendant. Be careful with your words. Soon, the guards will start relaying the messages downwards. At that time, every single sentence spoken from these 20 stone chairs will be passed down to Star Plaza. He is, after all, our king. We can only hope that our remonstrance is useful. These Northlanders, it's been 50 years, but they show no improvement at all. In his heart, the old Duke shook his head. Suddenly, there was a surging uproar. The noises composed of the murmurs from the crowd became louder and louder. Gilbert's familiar voice rang out, in the name of the Supreme King of Constellation, Kessel Jadestar. Subjects of the kingdom, bow down to your king. Thales raised his brows. A group of people entered the Hall of Stars through another side door. Like roaring waves, the people in the crowds kneeled on a one knee, only standing up after the king was a distance away. The robust Kessel V was still holding his scepter in one hand. His expression was cold and authoritative as he stepped into the Hall of Stars. 8 royal guards kept a tight watch behind him. The king immediately became the center of attention. Even though the people were kneeling, the crowd's murmurs did not reduce. Instead, they became louder. The Duke of Eastern Sea tapped his plump cheeks and spoke smilingly, His Majesty is here. Why don't you raise your suggestion to him personally? Poof. The Duke of the Northern Territory snorted in disdain. As if he will listen to me. King Kessel walked towards his stone chair in huge strides. At that moment, he suddenly raised his head, and whether intentionally or not, glanced towards the position of the darkroom. Thales clenched his fist slightly. He regulated his breathing and calmed his mood. Calm down, Thales, the real show has not yet begun. A group of people led by Gilbert followed closely behind the Iron Fist King's cape. Among them was the mature and tall Jins. It was only then did Thales see that Gilbert's family emblem was that of an open book. The large-bellied Duke Cullen said with a smile, it's Constellation's cunning fox, Count Queso. Together with Count Godwin, Viscount Kenny, Baron Gales and Lord Croppen, all of them are the kingdom's future. Our clever and wise female official, Madame Jins is with us, too. Seated on his stone chair, Val shook his head in disdain. People from the king's partisan. Hopefully, they will soon understand that the best way to support their king would be to think of ways to stop him from doing crazy things. That is the way to go rather than use every conceivable method to attack the 19 noble families who are the backbone of the kingdom. As for that bitch, every single second of her being in the palace is an insult to the Arundi family. Woohoo the king dash. At that moment, an even louder cheer rang from outside into the Hall of Stars. The hall was immediately filled with a deafening roar that boomed from far away. On one hand, many of the nobles' expressions changed. On the other hand, members of the populace who have some status whispered into each other's ears excitedly. Some even cheered along. Thales came to a realization. It was the crowd outside on Star Plaza cheering. Duke Cullen pouted his lips. I suppose that the guards have already begun passing down the messages to the plaza? Val turned his head, his face was pale. Kessel went in front of the 13 stone chairs and looked at his vassals. The members of the 13 distinguished families rose and lined up before him. They all kneeled down on one knee to show their loyalty. Expressionlessly, Kessel extended his right hand towards a noble, whose emblem was the 5-pointed star, for him to kiss the ring on his finger. The king said plainly, Burn Talon, you are the first one. You are still the first one. You have always been the first one. Blood is thicker than water, your majesty. The Talon family is a branch of the Jadestar family, just like how the 5-pointed star will always be part of the 9-pointed star. Kessel's brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded and walked towards the next noble. His authoritative voice reverberated, making every gaze focus on him. Smith Sorrel, I heard that you and your territory fervently opposed the tax exemption for the opening up of border counties? Of course, your majesty. The middle-aged noble, who had a golden sun symbol on his clothing, kissed the king's ring and shook his head firmly. How can I allow the noble's blood to be tarnished? Kessel snorted softly. The king extended his hand towards a noble who had a black lion, bearing its fangs and brandishing its claws, embroidered on his chest. Louis Bosdorf, the skillful black lion, would he still fight for the pride? The noble kissed the king's ring and smiled meaningfully. He gave a crafty reply, I swear I will fight to my death, your majesty. If the alpha lion was still smart and brave, he will always care for the pride. Kessel nodded and continued walking. Kessel walked towards Count Karabayan with a nostalgic expression, Tarami Karabayan, I remember that you used to be part of the Starlight Brigade, risking your life for John. Count Karabayan spoke seriously, kissing the king's ring, I risked my life for my homeland. Everything is for the peace of Constellation. Deep in thought, Kessel nodded, then continued walking. Derek Chroma, you look smarter than your father, he said to the young Derek in a profound manner, the crow who wanted to save his master even though he only had one wing. Is he still at Wingfort? Derek Chroma, who had a single-winged crow tattooed on his body, spoke cleverly with a neutral face. He kissed the king's ring. That crow owes his life to his master, and was also raised by his master. That is why he risks his life to rescue his master. Of course, the crow forever belongs to Wingfort. Kessel tapped his shoulder and walked towards the next noble, who was half-bald, and extended his right hand. Haj Dagestan. This noble had 2 long swords, positioned against each other in the form of a cross, embroidered on his clothing. Kessel coldly said, I still remember that your clan's motto is, forward or backward, survive or fall. This time, have your people decided on which direction to go? The half-balding Haj Dagestan lowered his head to kiss the king's ring, making his expression unclear. There has always been only one direction. However, people who stand too tall often cannot see it clearly. Kessel snorted furiously and coldly, not bothering to hide his dissatisfaction towards the other person at all. This time, the king extended both hands towards 2 resolute and steadfast nobles. One had a white bear as his symbol, and the other a steel-colored wall. Wilco Samunto, Barrett Fries, can Overwatch City and Lonely Old Tower endure the cold wind from the north? Wilco Samunto, who had a full beard, kissed the king's ring and spoke heroically, Cold Wind? For Constellation, Overwatch City can even block the great dragon's flames of fury. The bald beret Freeze refused to seem inferior. He kissed the ring with blazing eyes. Even the lonely old tower stands in cold and roaring winds, no matter how bitterly cold it gets, the furnace fire in the tower will always burn. Under the king's signal, the two northern nobles slowly stood up. Kessel walked past all members of the 13 distinguished families who were present, and headed towards the two dukes. He waved his hands and stopped Bob Cullen, who was swaying as he tried to stand up. Forget about it, Prime Minister. Your stomach is practically heavier than my scepter. The Duke of Eastern Sea was smiling as though he could not understand the meaning behind Kessel's words. He only nodded and thanked the king. Next to him, Jins took off Kessel's cape so that he could sit comfortably on the highest stone chair. Kessel glanced at Val, then shook his head, not at all bothered by his attitude. As for you, I suppose that your knees are afflicted with a strange illness which makes them unable to bend? Val Arundi spoke carelessly, his gaze burned with fury. Yes, when I am facing Extet and the crown of Constellation, I will get this illness. Kessel shook his head. It has been 40 years and your sense of humor has not yet improved. After the ceremony of allegiance, which carried a somewhat profound meaning both publicly and privately, the nobles from the 13 distinguished families returned to their seats. Gilbert reported with a solemn expression, out of the 6 guardian dukes, 2 are present. Out of the 13 distinguished families, 8 are present. Your Majesty? Wait for a while longer, Kessel spoke steadily. A deafening cheer rang once again from Star Plaza. Amid the cheering, Val scornfully said, all of a sudden, you announced that the Higher Parliament Conference has turned into a national conference, and you even wanted to hold it at an earlier time. How many noble families, who live too far away, do you think would make it in time? At least, it would be impossible for Blade City's T-Bark family. Kessel shook his head. His face was expressionless. This is a chess game between the warlords of Constellation. The players were destined to participate long ago, and the match had also started long ago. It seems that the crown has not only made you king, but also a horrible bard. Val Arundi spoke indignantly, clenching his teeth so hard that it made grating sounds. Only the Duke of Eastern Sea smoothed things over with a smile. In the dark room, Thales suddenly felt his heart clench. He saw a black-robed old man who also held a cane, standing at the back of the king's partisan. Everyone around tried to avoid the old man, except for a young man who trailed behind him. The young man was dressed in a similarly plain white robe. That's Morat Hansen. Why is he here too? Lord Lorbeck, who was beside Cohen, furrowed his brows as he watched the black-robed figure. My whole body shivers when I see that poisonous snake. He is our kingdom's chief of intelligence, and a non-voting delegate of the Imperial Conference. It's only natural that he has to come. Cohen furrowed his brows, too. He obviously did not like that person. However, Director, if we go by what you just said, His Majesty and the Prime Minister, who see him every day, should have frozen to death a long time ago. That's? Under his father and the Director's surprised gaze, the blonde-haired police officer, Cohen Karabayan, took quick steps forward. With a furious and indignant expression, he walked towards the Black Prophet, Morat Hansen. Chapter 59, The Warlord's Chess Game, 2. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, Cohen strode towards the young man behind the Black Prophet. Raphael. The nobles surrounding the 13 stone seats turned their gazes towards Cohen. The man held back the emotions that he could hardly contain and shouted at the young man, Raphael Lindbergh. The young man dressed in a white robe also saw Cohen striding towards him. He gave a frivolous smile and murmured into Morat's ear before walking towards Cohen. You went missing for 3 years. Even the 2 dukes and the king who was sitting high on his throne could notice Cohen's flaming rage. Cohen. The young man's voice was lively and bright, and it was a voice that could arouse fondness from others, just like his appearance. He opened his arms wide open towards Cohen. You're still so energetic. Cohen brusquely slapped Raphael's arm away from him. Why did you leave without a single notice? He glanced at the king's partisans and also Lord Morat Hansen, who stood by himself at the side with no one approaching him. Cohen's voice was tinted with disbelief. You're following the Black Prophet now? Do you know how much his hands are stained with blood and evil deeds? Raphael laughed. That's a misconception from the entire world. Sir Hansen contributed greatly for Constellation. He sacrificed a tremendous lot, even more so than any of the other nobles right here with us. Cohen was stunned and for a moment, he could not find any phrases to refute, so he said, we can talk about this later. What on earth did you do during these past 3 years? Stayed by Sir Hansen's side, listened and followed his teachings. Raphael still looked as nonchalant and relaxed as ever. Teachings? Cohen was momentarily stunned, the surprised look on his face was then taken over by indignation. This is your reason? You dumped Miranda for 3 years for no reason. And all of it was because you went running to that venomous snake to listen to his teachings? Miss Miranda? Raphael suddenly became cold and callous, gently crossing his arms across his chest. She was never mine, so how can you claim that I dumped her? Cohen stared in utter disbelief at his old friend, as if this was the first time he knew Raphael. Are you crazy? Miranda was still waiting for you to find. Please ask her to get rid of all those unrealistic thoughts. It's for her own good. Cohen widened his eyes and sighed. If you still think you're not worthy enough for her, I can tell you right now that she doesn't care. Raphael coldly cut Cohen off. That's the past. People change. I really liked her in the past, but now, I don't like her anymore, period. The young man in white noticed the gazes from the people on the 6 stone seats, and he whispered, this is not the right place to catch up on old times. Pardon me, I must leave. But as he was turning to leave, his shoulder was tightly grabbed by Cohen. Cohen contained his boiling anger. You have yet finished what you need to say. Damn it. What's wrong with you? It's impossible for a person to change so quickly. Raphael, his expression still cold and callous, grabbed Cohen's hand. That is because you failed to actually see my true colors, the sword of the Twin Towers heir, Officer Karabayan. Cohen held onto Raphael's shoulder with brute strength, his eyes were burning with flames of anger and bewilderment. He knew the young man in front of him was a genius with eidetic memory in the Tower of Eradication. Among the cohorts in the tower, he was even the first to awaken his power of eradication. He was also the runner-up in the final appraisal before they left the tower. He only came in second to Miranda, and he even scored a place higher than Cohen himself. He was a swordsman of eradication with a promising and boundless future. But why? With a determined look, Cohen clenched his teeth and said, the Raphael I know would never make a choice like this. That day after you left the tower, we lost all news about you after that. What happened? What happened? Raphael sneered. I got a good look at the real world. The next second, a freezing, cold, chaotic power of eradication engulfed Cohen's hand, which was seized by Raphael. It immediately evoked the starry blue power of eradication within him to put up a violent resistance against it. The surging waves of the power of eradication forced him to let go, but Cohen did not care about this. What he cared about was the other thing. Cohen glanced at his old friend in complete astonishment as he asked in disbelief, Raphael, your power of eradication, I clearly remembered it was sort of baptism's death, but why did it change to this? Raphael raised his eyebrow and flashed a complicated smile. He replied briskly, compared to the original me, I have become better. Cohen could only stare at Raphael, dumbfounded, watching his old friend from the Tower of Eradication turn his back on him without hesitation or reluctance to part. With his back towards Cohen, Raphael turned his head sideways slightly to give him a cold look. A word of advice, Cohen Karabayan, be careful today. Raphael coldly walked back towards Morad Hansen's side. The police officer furrowed his brows and clenched his fist. His eyes were filled with complex emotions and astonishment. That feeling, could it be? The shadow of the sword and the light from the sword at Red Street Market that night emerged before Cohen's eyes. That swordsman in the red and black attire, with his frenzied sword style that was murderous and indomitable. And more importantly, his violent and uncontrollable power of eradication. Cohen took in a deep breath. It can't be. After a few seconds, he exhaled and slowly walked back to his father's side. Don't ask. With anger and confusion boiling in him, Cohen concluded with the 2 words when he faced his father and the director's puzzled stares. When the 13 distinguished families Javia family, with the symbol of the sun-shooting bow, Almond family, with their use of deep blue waves as their emblem, and also Lasha family, with the 4-winged monitor lizard, arrived at the scene, the crowd was once again in an uproar. But it was nothing compared to later when the Covendir family arrived, there was more enthusiasm for their arrival. Thales, who was in the dark compartment, spotted the person who caused the uproar from the crowd with his eagle-like vision. The mild-mannered and amiable suzerain of Jade City, the guardian duke of the south coast, Zayn Covendir, beside an old man with a dignified posture, smiled and nodded towards the surrounding people as they strolled along the path slowly. As he was approaching the 13 stone seats, a number of nobles stood up and bowed to pay their respects. Zayn patiently returned their greetings one by one. Zayn walked to the utmost center of the stone seats, kneeled down on one knee in front of the expressionless Kessel V, and kissed the ring on his hand. Kessel furrowed his brows slightly. Covendir, I heard that you had a small misunderstanding with the royal guards yesterday. Zayn gave a captivating smile. It was only a small matter, you do not have to trouble yourself over this, your majesty. Kessel nodded as he glanced meaningfully at Zayn's smile. Let us hope that today will be the same. Zayn paused slightly. Indeed, there must be something that went wrong. It should be the scene where the nobles forced the appointment of an heir, but his majesty seemed prepared. The royal guards passed down the message from one tier to the subsequent tier, and so the earth-shaking shouts of cheers could be heard from the bottom upwards. Woo! Woo! Covendir. Iris flowers, tricolor iris flowers. Thales' heart sank. The Duke of Tricolor Iris Flowers was this popular? While listening to the thunderous cheers below Renaissance Palace, the young Duke maintained his composure as he steadily stood up. The butler silently held his cape from behind him. Zayn sat on one of the 6 stone seats and smiled at the other 2 dukes, who each had a different expression on their faces. The smiling Duke Bob Cullen raised his hand, and introduced the young man to the cold-looking Iron Eagle. Val, this is the young Zayn. While scrutinizing Zayn with a cold look, the Duke of the Northern Territory nonchalantly cut off the fat Duke, Iris Flowers, you are the youngest Duke of Constellation? Duke Cullen, who was interrupted earlier, did not take any offense as he smiled and rubbed his belly. Zayn was stunned. He felt that the other party's gaze was too sharp for him to meet his gaze. This is Val the Iron Eagle? He seems just as the rumors described him to be, but I wonder what his reaction would be when Extet soldiers focus on the Northern Territory. Zayn laughed gently and bowed slightly with his hand on his chest. A pleasure to meet you, the Master of White Eagle, Duke Arundi. Pardon me for not daring to accept the title of the youngest Duke. According to what I know, T-Bark family's master is much younger than I. Val's expression did not change and he spoke in a manner that allowed no disagreement, it is fine. Since you are already seated in this position, it means that you already have your right to enter this game. At this moment, a disharmonious, piercing noise made its way through the crowd and interrupted the conversation of almost half the hall. Thales heard an unexpected sharp voice come from another side door and pass through the crowd. What a shame, every time I step into this city, this alleged royal capital. The crowd dispersed, the nobles' gazes were complicated, some with hatred and some with excitement. I can smell that particular scent of the people from the city, that stench of luxury and privilege, makes me want to puke. The person with the sharp voice limped across the carpet towards the nobles, alongside his entourage. Just like the dying old man who sits in office and does nothing but receives his pay, and also the immature pretty boy who actually made it to the 6 dukes' thrones. His speech caused a commotion from many of the nobles. Above the 6 stone seats, Zayan's expression froze whereas the plump Duke Cullen laughed. Valarundi narrowed his eyes and clenched his fist tightly. Thales discovered to his surprise that the person walking towards the venue was a sparse-haired, middle-aged man with a pale yet haggard complexion. Even a part of his lips had sunk inwards, making him look as if he lost the upper row of his teeth. The only sign that proved that he was a living human being was his eyes, which were incisive and full of life. One of his legs was clearly crippled. With the help of a crutch, he paced one step at a time onto the starry blue carpet, and walked towards the 6 stone seats. Valarundi's knuckles cracked as he clenched his fist and looked disdainfully at the approaching man. It has been years since we last met, you damned old man. Kessel V gave a ruminating smile from his throne. Cyril. It is good that you are here. Otherwise, the title of the most unpopular person in this meeting would be taken by our Duke Arundi. The Northern Territory Duke snorted. Ha 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 ha. The haggard middle-aged man, the suzerain of the ruins, the guardian duke of the western desert, Cyril Fakenhez, emitted a creepily long, piercing laugh as he hobbled his way before the king. With one hand still holding onto his crutch, he kneeled down to kiss the king's ring. With his sharp and chilly voice, he said, Fakenhez would never be absent, your majesty. All 3 of the dukes at the scene had different emotions displayed on their faces but had nonetheless kept quiet. Thales furrowed his brows. The moment Cyril bowed down, a creepy image of a skull could be seen on his blood-red cape, and the skull had 4 eye sockets. Fakenhez, the family who used the 4-eyed skull as their emblem, had always been mysterious. The family was located at the Barren Bone tribe, just opposite the western desert, and they were the first in line in the battle against the orcs. It's already 3 o'clock. 4 out of 6 dukes and 11 out of 13 nobles have already arrived. Your Majesty, we can begin. Gilbert looked around the entire hall and nodded solemnly towards Kessel. Kessel nodded his head slightly without a word. He flipped the scepter he was holding in his hand into the air and then hit it hard against the ground. Thump! For some unknown reason, the rumbling noise traveled through the whole hall from Thales' perception, as if it struck hard against the people's hearts. The sound in the hall slowly faded. Everyone, it is time. Kessel's sonorous, dignified voice spread crystal clear throughout the hall due to the special design of the Hall of Stars. Constellation's National Conference of year 672 in the calendar of eradication will begin now. The commotion within the Hall of Stars immediately fell into silence. Everyone was gazing at the center, where a strange silence had fallen among the king, 4 dukes, and 11 counts. It lasted until the guard passed the king's message to the outside of the hall. And so, beneath Renaissance Palace, the Star Plaza once again exploded with cheers and excitement, but it was completely different from what the capital's citizens imagined. The National Conference should have started with one noble questioning the National Conference itself and also by the 13 distinguished families exposing each other's misdeeds and attacking each other. Sorrel, what is the meaning of this? Bern Talon, the noble of the 5-pointed star, a noble in his prime years, and the distant relative of the Jade Star royal family, angrily questioned. Do you doubt His Majesty's authority in convening the National Conference? I do not doubt His Majesty's authority. He is the king, of course he can do anything he wants and pleases. Smith Sorrel, with the golden sun as his emblem, was the legitimate doubter of the National Conference, and the objector of the tax exemption for the opening up of border counties, refuted brusquely. What I am questioning is if he still reserves the minimum respect that all 19 noble families deserve. King Kessel gently stroked his scepter. He remained silent, as if he did not hear a single word. Count Sorrel snorted and continued, what we received was the General Edict of Constellation. It was supposed to be about brilliant nobles who all come together to hire Parliament to determine Constellation's future. It is not supposed to be this unconstrained mess of a conference where anyone can come and go as they wish. Voices of protest could be heard from the surrounding people but were immediately subdued by the voices of the nobles in the hall center, and also by the angry glances from the guards. Count Louis Bosdorf, who had just hinted a certain thing by saying that if the Alpha Lion was still smart and brave, rubbed his stubbly chin while he said in a contemplative tone, makes sense. Under this situation, nothing good can be achieved regardless of what will be discussed. Not to mention that big event, the higher parliament would be more suitable. We should immediately move to the smaller meeting room. The northern count with the white bear as his symbol, the mayor of Overwatch City coldly said, Bosdorf, what you meant was that we should disband, and then have a small meeting of just 19 people? We have already come this far, and you are still hooked on this matter? Did your mother forget to give you a brain when she was giving birth to you? In the great hall, everyone was noisily rambling about this undisguised insult. Even Duke Cullen and Zayan, who were sitting upon the 6 stone seats, furrowed their brows. Only the Duke of the Northern Territory scoffed. Bosdorf was not enraged by the comment as he chuckled, my mother has a great memory, so she probably did not forget that. However, Count Zamunto, you. His speech was interrupted by another noble from the northern territory. "Shut up, Black Lion, we are not really concerned about your mother, or the presence of your brain." Count Fries, the suzerain of the lonely old tower, who had the iron-colored long wall as his symbol, and who also came from the north, tapped rhythmically against the stone seat. With his face in a steely color, he said indifferently, "The southern royal capital is meant to be used to handle that great event. What we care about is Constellation's safety. But you southerners, you sons of bitches, are still concerned over the accuracy of titles and the invitations you obtained? The safety of Constellation?" Count Hajdegistan, who made a sarcastic remark earlier about him not being able to see the king clearly because he was standing too high up, also cut into the conversation. He shook his head. "Do not be arrogant, what you truly care about is your own safety. But I do not wish to criticize you, because I am not really that much more respectable than you." With his body leaning forward, his sharp gaze swept past every single noble. "The problem is not about the title of the invitation. The problem is actually about whether His Majesty would obtain the public's popular opinion and threaten his subordinates and the suzerains through this national conference. This is about the safety of us all, not just the northern nobles." The crowd once again burst into an uproar. Some people were even yelling, "Get lost, selfish nobles." However, in the midst of the chaos, Count Dagestan still waved at the suzerains. With his ferocious expression, he yelled at the top of his lungs, "Do not forget the Desert War. Do not forget how you were forced to enlist the people in your territories just to take revenge on behalf of the royal family." Only at this moment did Kessel V furrow his brows. Thales had to admit that the speech was very convincing. Thales also began to ponder about the motives for the current national conference. Count Talon put up both hands, his brows deeply furrowed together. "We can discuss the order in the future, but that issue is extremely urgent. We have to come up with the final decision in dealing with that matter today." "Decision? What decision?" Count Sorrel punched the stone seat, his eyes widened. "Under the watchful eyes of the public. Under such broad daylight. Before all these people, not to mention before our enemies, we cannot even mention what the matter is about. How do we even discuss it?" Simple, Black Lion Bosdor smiled as he said, "Everyone already knows about the matter, but what price are you willing to pay in order to resolve it?" Right at this very moment, a sharp laughter could be heard from the 6 dukes. "Ha ha ha, that matter? I say, why still cover it up when you have been saying it for such a long while? What are you afraid of? Extet? Are you afraid of the king? Or us dukes? Or afraid of the people both in the hall and out on the plaza below?" Everyone's expressions changed and looked towards the haggard Cyril Fakenhas. The guardian duke of the western desert, whose symbol was the 4-eyed skull, gave out a terrifying smile. "Let us just address it directly. Extet's diplomat group, alongside their prince, were murdered in Constellation." Everyone was shocked. Even if the 19 noble families had known about the incident through the general edict, it was still an undisclosed secret. How dare he, how dare he? Duke Cullen furrowed his brows. Duke Arundi slapped against his thigh, sighed and shook his head. Zayen, on the other hand, pressed his lips together tightly as he remained silent. Sir Fakenhas. Cohen's cousin, Derek Chroma, the Count of Wingfort who was located on the western side of the kingdom with the Western Desert Duke, tried to stop him with a ghastly expression. "We do not have to mention this in the national conference. Be quiet, boy. The adults are talking." Fakenhas rudely cut him off, leaving the Count of Wingfort, who somewhat knew Fakenhas, to hold his breath for a second. The old Count Karabayan, who was close to the Chroma family, could not help but furrow his brows. With a sullen face, Cyril Fakenhas grinded his teeth together and continued to expose the supposedly forbidden secret. "You are all well aware of this. It is only the people who do not know. Those savages will not let go of this opportunity. That lousy treaty has restricted them, but they've been rubbing their fists and wiping their palms as they waited for 12 years. Everyone in Constellation, regardless of the king, nobles, or commoners, listen closely. Constellation and Extet, war is coming between Western Peninsula's Shield and Blade." Chapter 60, Real Intentions Revealed at the End. The terror caused a commotion among members of the populace and those from the minor nobility classes as well as those from the intermediate nobility classes. The guards had no choice but to shout loudly. "Cyril, you are very daring in speech." Val gave Cyril a meaningful glance. "Thanks to you, no one will raise the question of returning to the private and small conference room now." The counts who were seated on their stone chairs responded with silence. Duke Fakenhas' gaze was dark. Even when he laughed, his voice was shrill. "This would have happened sooner or later. I only got rid of the relief and terror on your behalves. The banquet's unwelcome presence. Duke Cullen sighed. "Indeed, you deserve this title." Like most of the counts from the 13 distinguished families, Zayen's face was gloomy and he did not say anything. After more than 10 seconds, disorderly buzzing sounds from the panic-stricken populace in Star Plaza could be heard from the Hall of Stars. The news of the impending clash between Extet and Constellation was completely out in the open. Count Sorrel stared straight at the king with a hostile glare. "Your Majesty, you have achieved your desired effect in announcing this impending disaster to the citizens of our kingdom. The question is, how do we clear up this mess now?" Kessel's face was cold as ice and he said nothing. He only gave Sorrel a quick glance, the latter was still putting up a stubborn front. Count Talon stared impolitely at Sorrel. "It's easy. Do we fight or negotiate? If we were to fight, we shall return to our respective territories and mobilize our forces. We still have the chance to negotiate. We have allies. We can invite them to resolve the dispute, just like 12 years ago. Zayan slowly raised his head and looked at the other suzerains. War might not break out if we make the necessary sacrifices. Fakan has cut the young duke off and spoke sarcastically. The one who died in their diplomat group was a prince. He was King Nuben's only son and the only heir of the Walton family. Make sacrifices? True, we probably just have to cut off a piece of land from the north and give it to Extet. That will do. Count Zamanto said coldly, the Northern Territory will not hand over a single inch of land. Our family has guarded that land for generations. But it is true that the prince died within your territory, is it not? Count Dagestan laughed out loud. This is your responsibility. Of course, you have to pay the price. Count Fries raised his head, and there was a fierce glare in his eyes. If you are not joking, Dagestan, then we can have a duel on the stage of eradication right now. Alright, then. Why don't we hand them 20% of the eternal oil supply in Eastern Sea? Duke Fakan has pretended to be deep in thought. He first looked at Duke Cullen and then Zayan, flashing a nonchalant smile. How about the crystal drop or in the south? Even jokes must have a limit, Cyril, Duke Cullen replied in a rare show of sternness. Zayan flashed a friendly smile at him and shook his head slightly. At that moment, Kessel V knocked his scepter lightly on the floor. All the nobles went silent and looked towards him. Under the king's gaze, Gilbert nodded and took a step forward. He spoke with a frown. According to sources of the kingdom's secret intelligence department, Dragoncloud City already learned of their prince's demise in Constellation yesterday. The Archduke of Black Sand acted even faster than their king. He began recruiting troops and mobilizing his army 2 days ago. The 2 other archdukes in the southern part of Exted were 2 days slower than him, but there is not much difference. The hall was immediately in an uproar. Silence. Gilbert said, loud and stern. Amid the complicated emotions of the people in the hall, the Supreme King spoke in a low and sincere voice. If war breaks out between the 2 kingdoms, the royal family and the Talon family will give our all in assisting the Northern Territory. Count Talon nodded firmly. The king looked towards the Duke of the Northern Territory with a flat expression. Val, how many troops and provisions can you supply? Val Arundi responded sternly, how many troops? Are you joking? I have already called together all my vassals. We have 15,000 infantrymen, 1,000 archers, 500 heavy cavalier units and even a small amount of mystic guns. They will reinforce the Broken Dragon Fortress in the shortest time and receive orders from the commander, Lady Sonia Sasir. That is our territory. And if war breaks out, even the women and children will carry weapons. As for provisions, it depends on how much land we are able to defend. The 2 counts, Zamanto and Fries, nodded firmly and added on, the 3,500 people in Overwatch City shall pledge their lives in battle. Lonely Old Tower has only 2,000 infantrymen. However, we will fight until the end, even if there is only 1 soldier left. We can handle the pressure from the 3 archdukes of Extet. However, if it comes down to the entirety of Extet. The Duke of Northern Territory straightened his back and surveyed every single noble with a piercing gaze. We need the strength of all of Constellation. Cohen, who stood behind old Count Karabayan, scratched his head. In a low voice, he asked in bewilderment, isn't this national conference directed at the entire kingdom? Why are they announcing the disposition of their troops like that? Old Count Karabayan closed his eyes softly and sighed lightly, then lowered his voice and told his son with a tired expression, can't you see it? The nobles from the north are acting in front of Extet. Do you believe that Duke Arundi can gather 10,000 men? Constellation never recovered from the bloody year. I suspect that those suzerains have at most 1/3 of the troops they just declared. Cohen was immediately stunned. He looked towards the emblem of the 2 silver cross-shaped stars on the ceiling of the hall. As descendants of the Empire and the Western Peninsula's shield, has Constellation weakened to this extent? Kessel V nodded lightly and turned towards the scary-looking Cyril. How about the suzerains of the Western Desert? Cyril Fakan has tilted his head backwards and shut his eyes. The ruins can only dispatch 1,000 infantrymen. Lately, the Baron Bone tribe has been creating commotion again. As for mystic guns, we don't even have enough for ourselves. The young Count Derek Chroma muttered, Wingfort is not known for its military force, but we can dispatch 100 of the best Raven Whistle-like cavaliers. Bosdor furrowed his brows hard. Brave Souls Fort has been in a state of unrest lately. An orc was made leader. He is now gathering together the forces of power from various families. Black Lion family can only dispatch 200 men. The stinginess of the Western Desert nobles caused the nobles present to begin whispering among themselves. Cohen furrowed his brows. He once served at the Western Desert's front line during the Battle of Elimination I, which came after the Desert War. Based on what he knew, the Western Desert Army force was definitely not that weak. Val looked coldly at Fakanhaz. You were pretty enthusiastic when revealing the secret just now. When it came to the drafting of troops, humph. Another surge of cheers rang from Star Plaza into the Hall of Stars. This time, it was an excited cheer and there were many passionate voices inside. Count Talon touched his 5-pointed star breastpin inside. Hey! I bet that the guards have only passed down the messages regarding the Northern Territory's army force, but not the Western Deserts. Kessel V maintained his composure. He turned and asked Cullen, how about the Sun Sword and Shield family, and the entire Eastern Sea? The plump duke said with a smile, Your Majesty, most people on the Eastern Sea earn their living from the sea. we do not have enough troops. However, we can contribute on monetary terms and enlist mercenaries. If an all-out war breaks out, as long as it is not winter and the sea is not frozen, our naval fleet can even attack Extet's eastern shore. Beside the Duke of Eastern Sea, Count Noajavia and Count Clark Almond looked at each other and nodded. Duke Faken has spoken in a shrill voice. Thank you for reminding us that it happens to be December now. Winter is here. Kessel V tapped his stone chair and asked in a profound manner, so there are no men, only money? I remember that during the Desert War, you told me that you have no money, but can contribute men. And that it was still a little far to transport the troops from the Eastern Sea to the Western Desert? 5 years ago, all the people did not know how to go out and earn money. That is why there was no money, but plenty of men. But now, all the people are out earning money. That is why there are no men, but plenty of money, Duke Cullen answered with a smile and without batting an eyelid. The king snorted softly, and the Duke of the Northern Territories' expression turned extremely unpleasant. King Kessel turned his head towards the nobles from the south. Before the king could ask, Zayan answered with a worried tone, there are no usable cavaliers in the entire South Coast Hill. The Covendir family can gather 2,000 infantrymen from Jade City's borders. There are also some mystic guns. However, they might suffer due to the climate if they were to battle for an extended period of time in the north. My vassals will also definitely be unhappy. I cannot guarantee the quality of the troops. The old Count Karabayan also spoke at the appropriate time with a solemn expression. It is the same for Walla Hill. Even if the vassals are included, I am not confident that I will be able to gather even 300 soldiers. Cohen, who was behind the count, lowered his head and sighed softly. He still remembered that when his two sisters went to visit their friends, his father immediately dispatched 500 troops to escort them. Count Lasha was even more direct. The soldiers from the Moors are not suited to battle in the north at all. Kessel V did not say anything else. He only exhaled lightly. The guardian dukes of the land of Cliffs and Blade Edge Hill have not arrived yet. However, I assume that their stance, along with that of the other 4 families, would be the same. As nobles from the land of Cliffs region, Count Sorrel and Count Dagestan turned their heads and did not say anything. In contrast, the heads of trades and tradesmen who were observing the conference began whispering among themselves. More than anything, they were worried about the impending war. Is this how all of you would repay Constellation? The Duke of the Northern Territory looked extremely furious. He stood up abruptly and pointed at the 2 cross-shaped stars above him, then spoke furiously. This is the kingdom you swore your loyalty to and is also the greatest kingdom in human history. Even if the Northern Territory is not your territory, the double cross-shaped star's flag waves on it. Just like your territories. Count Dagestan said coldly, Your Grace, 5 years ago, I fought for Constellation, too. In the end, I lost my eldest son forever in the Western Desert. I guess you, who do not have a son, will not be able to understand this. Bullshit. Val opened his eyes wide in fury and turned his head abruptly. My only daughter, the heir of White Eagle, is now at Broken Dragon Fortress at the border between the 2 kingdoms. She is under the command of Lady Sonia Sasir, the Fortress Flower. Her life and death depends on the outcome of the battle between the Great Dragon and Constellation. Having heard this, Cohen could not help but lower his head. He sighed and looked towards Raphael, who stood behind the Black Prophet. Perhaps we don't have to wage war. We can choose to negotiate. Even if Extet dispatches their army, it would be for the sake of gaining something. Duke Cullen shook his head and sighed. And then force the Northern Territory to submissively hand over its land? Like a hunting falcon, Val blared at every single person who replied. At this moment, Zayan raised his head with a firm gaze and looked at the king. Now that we know the chips in our hands and the size of our troops, the choice of whether to battle or to negotiate depends on your majesty's will. Everyone's gazes immediately turned towards Kessel. Val's gaze was anxious and stern. There was a smile in Cullen's eyes, though it had a complicated look within it as well. Cyril's gaze was a ruminating one, and Zayan's gaze was calm. So, this is my kingdom? Kessel slowly raised his head. His gaze cut into every single suzerain like a knife. The king only has his regular troops and direct vassals in the face of the entire army force of another kingdom? Or I will have to represent Constellation and disgracefully agree to all their possible terms and conditions? Cyril Faken has grinned and said, there cannot be a battle without sufficient firepower. However, the royal family's dignity cannot be something that can be placed on the negotiating table either. Kessel V sighed, indeed, it is just as what Maynitinox says, all kings are lonely people. At that moment, a resounding voice angrily erupted with every single syllable practically roared from the main door of the Hall of Stars. Your Majesty, please take back those words. As long as we are around, you will never be lonely. As nobles of Constellation and descendants of the Empire, how can we back off? Amid the commotion in the hall, a noble who seemed to be in the prime of his life entered. His left eye was covered in horrifying scars, and he wore a yellow and black cape with an image of deer antlers on it. He walked towards the 6 stone chairs coolly and arrogantly. Part of the nobles and members of the populace in the hall started clapping enthusiastically. As for the rest, some sneered with contempt, and the others shook their heads and sighed. Duke Cullen flashed a resigned smile, while Val and Zayan looked grim. Nanchester's one-eyed dragon, Cyril Faken, has laughed loudly and said, I thought you would only arrive at night. The mayor of Steep Forest City and the guardian duke of the Land of Cliffs spoke with a fierce expression. Compared to this, look at what all of you have done. He kissed Kessel's ring but did not sit down on his stone chair. Instead, he turned towards Val. Sir Arundi, do not worry. Steep Forest City shall dispatch all its troops and head north towards Broken Dragon Fortress. However, under Val's surprised and complicated gaze, he immediately switched the topic and turned towards Kessel V. In the face of this war that will affect the whole nation, as long as you can set your followers' minds at ease, I cannot think of any reason to back down. Almost all the nobles in the hall furrowed their brows. Set his followers' minds at ease? Kessel V slowly said, Koshter, what do you mean? Your Majesty, do you still not understand? Koshter asked sternly, there is an impending all-out war, but the nobles are terrified and confused. They are making all sorts of excuses. Under this situation, to endure the torment of deciding whether to battle or to negotiate all alone, as our king. This is unfair to you. But why do you think this is happening? Koshter shut his single eye tightly and took a deep breath. He then firmly said, Iron Fist King, your Majesty. The suzerains and the nobles do not dare to follow you. All of Constellation is laden with fear. The tragedy was over 12 years ago, and the late king's remains are already buried. However, we still do not know what you are thinking. We do not know what sort of king we are following. All the nobles went completely silent in an instant. Gilbert and Jins furrowed their brows at the same time. Kessel tightened his grip on his scepter slightly and stared at Koshter with a complicated expression. However, Koshter continued speaking without backing down, we are all afraid of you. Nobody knows what a solitary king who acts without hesitation, who is the only person left in the Jadestar family, would do. Moreover, this is a war we are talking about. Koshter turned, the sharp gaze of his single eye swept past every single suzerain. He enunciated every single one of his words clearly, Your Majesty. The blood is gone, but Constellation still remains. Why do you have to endure the suspicion and envy of nobles, even when it comes to such an obvious choice of whether to go to war? Kessel V's gaze became increasingly dark and cold. On the other hand, the four dukes simultaneously avoided his gaze. Koshter pointed at the two cross-shaped stars on the ceiling and spoke loudly, Your Majesty, for the benefit of Constellation and for the dignity of the Jadestar royal family, we cannot be hesitant when it comes to this crisis. That is why, Your Majesty, please share the burden of Constellation with us. To battle or to negotiate. Let all of us bear the price of this decision together. If Constellation is to have a bright future and a stable society, and if the royal family does not cease to exist, I believe that no one will back down in the face of such an important war for the kingdom. At that moment, many people have already sensed something. Morad Hansen lowered his head, soundlessly curling up his lips. It's coming. That was fast. Zayan squeezed his nose bridge and shut his eyes. It's coming. Hopefully it goes well. Cullen smiled as he watched Koshter act. It's coming, interesting. Val looked at the guardian duke of the Land of Cliffs in a daze and clenched his teeth. Is this their aim? Are both Cal and I their prey? The counts were whispering to each other on their stone chairs. Some of them were plagued with worry and the others nodded profusely. Only the members of the populace who were observing the meeting whispered among themselves in confusion. However, everything in the Hall of Stars was still ongoing. Your Majesty, you will soon be 48 years old, on the eve of Constellation's battle with the dragon. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, Koshter threw off his cape and, with a stern expression, he waved his arm towards the nobles in the hall. Please choose an heir to the kingdom among us nobles. Please use your action to tell the nobles that you still care about this kingdom's stability and continuity, that you still trust these suzerains, who are your right hands. Then, we will battle for Constellation's dignity and Jadestar's honor. Without complaints. Without backing down. Silence. Absolute silence. A suffocating silence. No one dared to be the first one to say something after hearing these words. That was until a shrill and unbridled laughter broke the silence. Ha ha ha. Under everyone's bewildered gaze, Duke Faken has opened his mouth and laughed crazily and joyfully. His messy teeth looked especially scary. What did the Far Easterners say again? Real intentions will be revealed at the end? Your Majesty, do you want to fight this war with dignity? Exchange it with your throne. Ha 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 ha. Editor's note, not to be confused with the Battle of Eradication.